Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. Welcome to our annual public conference we've held since the organization was founded. The program was founded almost 20 years ago. So fall of 2004 will be our 20th anniversary. We created the program. Alistair Ian Johnson, professor at Harvard, who's here, created the program with me while I was at Princeton. We moved the program to Columbia 5 years ago. We're very proud of the fellows who've been in the program. Many of them have traveled from around the world to be here. The record holder for this year is Courtney Fung, who came from Australia. We have someone who came from Korea, someone who came from Taiwan, but Courtney is the record holder for this year. We've had over 50 fellows since the program was founded. They are now in various important positions in the United States, in Canada, and in 3 other continents. And we have many tenure track, many tenured professors, and it makes me feel old. We even have chaired professors who were I'm looking at Scott Kastner from the University of Maryland there, who was my undergrad at Cornell and always makes me feel old with all of his successes. We're very proud of all of them. We think that the program has been successful in increasing the knowledge of China's rise in the United States and around the world, and most important, conveying that knowledge to the next generation of American and global citizens. So the fact that so many of our alumni of the program are in teaching positions, we believe is a force multiplier for the benefits provided by the program. I wanted to thank Daniel Sahensky, who makes all this possible all the time, both the speaker series during the year and the annual conference. Where's Daniel? He's never here when I thank him. He's very stealthy that way. Anyway, thank you, Daniel. I wanted to thank the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. They're co-sponsoring this day. And Peter Clement, who is the current leader of that institute, will be here later this afternoon. He's not here now. I wanted to thank the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, who's been our partner. They provide support for us, and they provide a conference room for our speaker series, and I'm grateful to them. Most of all, I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who's been a very generous supporter of the program going back to the days in Princeton. And Margaret Gatch from the corporation is here, and I wanted to thank. She's representing Steve Del Rosso, who's been a long-term supporter of the program. We're very grateful. And I wanted to thank the Chubb Foundation, which has also given us generous support recently, and we're quite grateful for that. And the Chubb CEO, Evan Greenberg. So I have a distinct pleasure today, which is I want to thank SIWPS, the School of International Public Affairs, which helped me move the program here, gave support, and continues to give support. And there's been no bigger supporter of the China and the World program than our current dean, Karen Yarhi-Milo, who is the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations at Columbia University, in addition to being the new dean at the School of International Public Affairs. Karen and I go way back. We were colleagues together at Princeton, and I was thrilled that she came to Princeton originally. I was thrilled that she became a senior faculty member at Princeton, and I'm thrilled that she agreed to come over to Columbia a year or 2 after I came over. And now I'm thrilled she's dean. She's a big supporter of the program, and we really need that support. Because the program does international relations theory and area studies together, the reason we created the program is we thought the field of political science was moving away from that combination, and we wanted to foster the careers of scholars who still put in the time to do both. So since you're all scholars of international relations theory and area studies, you'll be familiar with Karen Yarhi-Milo's award-winning work on intelligence and on decision-making. Know thy adversary, a term that should be ring in the ears of China scholars, and who fights for reputation. These are 2 award-winning books. She's a leader in the study of political psychology, and like me, Karen was a student of the late Robert Jervis, And she follows in that tradition, and we're very lucky to have her at Columbia as an expert in international relations and political psychology. I was really pleased to learn when she became the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations, because that was Bob Jervis's chair. And I can't think of a more worthy recipient than Karen for that honor. And so I get a little choked up when I introduce Karen. So I will just say over to Karen. I'm really grateful to you. I know how busy you are. Really grateful to you for starting to launching our conference today. It's going to be a really good conference. We have great panels, and thank you all for being here.
Good morning, and great to be with you. And thank you, Professor Christensen, my dear friend and colleague, and Professor Ian Johnston for your remarks and for beginning our important dialogue today. It is really my pleasure to welcome you to SIWPS. This is the International Conference on China and the World, and this conference is a remarkable collaboration. Led by the China and the World program at Columbia at Harvard, and in coordination, as you just heard, with the Saltzman Institute and War and Peace Studies, this conference brings together some of the world's top minds on China and international relations. And I want to extend my appreciation to the panelists. We're going to hear from them from here and from abroad who have come today to SIWPS to contribute to this dialogue. And thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. The demand for diverse knowledge and reliable analysis of China's role in the world has never been greater. I hear it in every conversation I attend. We are extremely fortunate at SIWPS that in 2018, Professor Thomas Christensen brought over the China and the World program to Columbia, which is a globally recognized leader in the study of China's foreign relations. Through its emphasis on interdisciplinary research, the China and the World program encourages truly innovative way of thinking about Chinese foreign relations, to think about China's rise. One of the program's greatest strengths is how it fosters that understanding in its fellows and alumni, and share that knowledge with the next generation of policy leaders and with global citizens and academics. It is really remarkable, the achievement of this program over the years. Two recent fellows, Julian Gerwitz and Jessica Chain Weiss, have held important roles already on China policy at the National Security Council and the State Department, respectively. Professor Christensen himself has been a senior State Department official and continues to play crucial roles, advisory roles for the US government as one of the nation's foremost experts on China's policy. And many of the alums here in the program also engage in government advising and offer testimonies. And this is a big part of what we do, and we are so fortunate for this. The China and the World program brings together recognized experts and first-class resources for the support of young scholars. And this is exactly what we strive to do here as a policy school. SIWPS is launching what I call the 2.0 version of the school. And what we've done very well, and we're going to even double down on, is this how we translate knowledge into action across all interdisciplinary research hubs. In the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, we do this, which is, this institute co-hosts this event, as Tom said. The Saltzman Institute is the leading research center that investigates the dimensions of international relations, especially among the great powers like China and Russia. And here you see already the synergy between China and the world. I'll talk in a bit about the Weatherhead Institute and a center like the Saltzman Institute. This is all coming together in a place like SIWPS. In this time of extreme geopolitical instability due to Russia's war in Ukraine, the Saltzman scholars have been demonstrating their expertise in international politics and conflict analysis, informing the understanding of both policymakers and the public. As Russia's most powerful global partner, China has been an important, crucial part and understanding those discussions. With rising concerns about mainland China's policies toward Taiwan, as well as its growing presence in international politics and security, the collaboration between China and the world, the Saltzman Institute, and SIPA at large have never been more valuable. The natural exchange of knowledge between SIPA research centers and the broader Columbia community is exactly what produces such nuanced and reliable analysis of world events. In joint collaboration this year with Columbia's Weatherhead East Asian Institute, they have hosted talks by prominent government officials, including the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Dr. Jun Pak, and former senior House-wide State Department and intelligence officials. This collaboration has also brought us here today. The International Conference on China and the World further advances what I believe are SIPA's core values, namely forging connections between new developments across research fields and among each other by thinking globally. And I believe this is what SIPA does best as a public policy school. At the heart of our research are 5 global policy challenges, and indeed we reorganized the school around 5 global challenges: geopolitical stability, democratic resilience, inclusive prosperity and macroeconomic stability, climate and sustainable development, and technology and innovation. Those are the 5, and many of which we will be discussing today in relations to China and the world. This really is a special opportunity to have so many leading experts gathered here to offer their insights, and we have so much to learn from their perspectives and from one another. The conference will consist of 3 panel discussions on the big questions facing Chinese international relations. These include security challenges in East Asia, great power relations during China rise, and the relationship between Xi Jinping's China and the developing world. The conference will conclude with final remarks by Professor Thomas Christensen. He and Professor Peter Clement, the interim director of the Saltzman Institute, were the ones who made all of this possible. And I would like to pass on my appreciation and gratitude. I'm very proud of this program. As Tom said, I'm a big supporter of this. I think it's a really crucial part of what we do at SIPA, especially today. And I want to thank everyone for coming to that, what promised to be an essential and informative conference. I thank you for being here today. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Maybe that first panelist could come up. Patty's in the lead, right? Patty Kim. All right. Getting the band back together here. Thanks very much, Karen. I appreciate it.
Why don't you just, yeah. Oh, thank you. Just here. Lana, do you want to bring this one? Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Patty Kim, and I'm a Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I work on China and East Asia broadly. And it's just really a pleasure to be here. I just want to thank the China and the World program, the Saltzman Institute, Tom, Daniel, and Ian for inviting me to moderate this first panel. I think just looking at the lineup of great scholars we have for this conference, it just really speaks to the wonderful work that you all, the China and the World program, has done in fostering scholars who look at this important topic. And I'm just really privileged to count myself an alum of the program and a former student of Tom's. So our panel today is entitled Xi's China and Security Challenges in Asia and Beyond. And we're really lucky to have 4 excellent panelists across a range of expertise. And starting from my left, is we have Yeling Tan, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oregon, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Yelling's research lies at the intersection of international and comparative political economy with an emphasis on China and the developing world. Next up, we have Alana Kralikowski, who is an assistant professor at the Department of History and Political Science at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. And her areas of expertise include China's technological modernization and the intersection of US-China relations and high-tech sectors. Next, we have Scott Kastner, who is a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland College Park. And Scott's research focuses on the international politics of East Asia and US-China relations. He's the author of a number of books, including his most recent monograph on war and peace in the Taiwan Strait that was just published last fall. And last but certainly not least is Isaac Cardin, who is a senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which makes him a direct neighbor of me. Carnegie is right next door to Brookings. And until very recently, Isaac was at the U.S. Naval War College as an assistant professor, where his research focused on China's maritime affairs. Isaac is also the author of a book that is fresh off the press entitled China's Law of the Sea, The New Rules of Maritime Order. So we really couldn't have a better lineup for this panel today. And so I'm just going to jump right in to the discussion. Okay, so Yeling, there's been a rapid succession of crises, both inside and outside of China over the last few years. This past November, just weeks after President Xi secured his unprecedented third term at the 20th Party Congress, we saw an outbreak of protests against China's extreme zero COVID measures across the country, and then abrupt dropping of this policy in December, which resulted in a deadly COVID wave that, according to some estimates, claimed the lives of up to 1.5 million people. The Chinese economy has also suffered greatly since the lockdowns. Its property market is in a historic slowdown, and China is also facing long-term demographic challenges. And this is all happening amidst a major war going on in Ukraine, and as US-China relations hits a low point in decades for a number of reasons that we'll unpack throughout this panel. And so there's a lot to be anxious about for China's long-term prospects for its economy and its broader trajectory. But there are also reports that domestic consumption is picking up, that China may be having a good economic rebound later this year. And so to start us off today, can you give us your take on the state of China's domestic economy, its broader domestic situation in the post-COVID era? Are things looking better or worse for Beijing in the coming months and years? And what are the implications for China's foreign policy? Yeah. I'll ask you. Okay.
All right, so thanks very much, Patty, for the introductions, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be on this panel. So I think if we look at China today, it faces a host of challenges, some of which, as Patty has outlined, both domestically and externally. On the domestic front, the stresses have actually been building for a number of years now. So there's rising inequality, right, with levels that exceed OECD countries, an imbalanced and an investment-heavy economic model. And despite efforts for close to a decade now to shift to a less investment-heavy and more consumption-oriented economy, overall efforts have not been quite successful, right? The fall in consumption as a share of GDP has plateaued rather than increased. There's an aging and shrinking population base with levels of education that are far lower than that would be needed for China to shift to a more knowledge-based economy. There are rising debt to GDP ratios. There are financial risks in the property sector. And I think the Chinese government is well aware of all of these problems. The question is how it has been responding, or how its system can respond to all of these domestic challenges. And in thinking about how it can respond to these challenges, I think we have to first go back to the political context and to go back to perhaps October with the 20th Party Congress, right? I think that when the lineup for the Politburo Standing Committee was revealed, there was no doubt in most people's minds as to who would walk out first, right? But the clean sweep of loyalists who followed Xi Jinping into the room, I think took many analysts by surprise. So with this dramatic consolidation of power by Xi Jinping, I think that raises two rather distinct scenarios for how the Chinese party state might deal with these domestic problems, but also external problems, also problems dealing with the external economy. And the two scenarios, I think, actually go back to a long-standing tension within the party state system in its policy making, veering and swinging between political campaigning on the one hand, and pragmatic calibration on the other. So the first scenario, which I'm actually quite skeptical about, is that with Xi's consolidation of power, he would be able to govern more confidently and more effectively and be more open to alternative viewpoints, because listening to these alternative viewpoints no longer face the risk of ceding influence to a competing faction, right? So that, from that perspective, it might increase the chances of pragmatic calibration. I'm skeptical about that. I think the second scenario is that China continues to go down the road of policymaking based very much on political campaigns, right? Policies that emerge suddenly, that generate sudden swings, that generate social as well as market dislocations, and which require a long time and a lot of costs to correct. I think the second scenario is probably more likely because, in contrast to the previous leaderships, which had delegated power to the bureaucracy and rewarded it for demonstrating competence, the current leadership has instead sent a chill into the bureaucracy through a permanent anti-corruption campaign and demands above all a show of loyalty. So if you're in the bureaucracy, you're a lower level official, you're responding to governance problems, these real governance problems on the ground, by seeking to signal loyalty rather than competence. And this has led to a deterioration of feedback mechanisms and eroded the ability of policies to be calibrated on based on facts on the ground. Instead, you see decisions being unleashed on targets with very little prior consultation. And there are many examples to choose from here when we think about the domestic economy, right? We can think about the crackdown on the tutoring industry. We can think about the regulatory wave of on the technology sector. And most sweeping of all, the zero COVID policies that Patty reminded us of in her introduction. Each of these different policy campaigns, if we can call them that, has alienated a different group, right? With the tutoring industry, it was the middle class. With the tech crackdown, it was the platform economies and the large private sectors in there. With zero COVID, it was most of Chinese society, and all of which have also left foreign businesses wondering whether or not they're able to operate in China to deal with a rational and pragmatic government. I do want to clarify, I don't want to leave a mistaken impression here that this style of policymaking has overtaken the Chinese economy. I think that it's the concern that I'm worried about is the relative balance between political campaign as a policy style on the one hand and pragmatic calibration, right? We still see evidence of pragmatic calibration. There's still technocratic, steady technocratic work being done, right? The government recognizes a lot of the problems. So we see more recently, right, announcements coming out that the central government will make more transfer payments to local governments because they recognize that these local governments are under a lot of fiscal stress. We see policy announcements about more subsidies and support being given to the education sector, to the healthcare sector, right? All of this is still ongoing. I think it's the relative balance that we need to be concerned about, and whether or not, right, in this upcoming third term of Xi Jinping, right, whether or not we see more of the second scenario compared to the first scenario.
Thank you. That's really helpful to get a sense of what's going on inside of China. Looking at the US-China relationship, there's been a lot of turmoil in the US-China economic relationship, starting with the trade war in 2018, and then most recently, the export restrictions on semiconductors. Can you kind of explain to us how Beijing has been responding to the use of tariffs and export restrictions in recent years, and how does this response differ or how is it similar to how Beijing has handled previous periods of economic uncertainty?
So thanks for that. So I think the deteriorating external environment, right, just layers on a whole other set of challenges that the Chinese government needs to grapple with. If we look at how the Chinese government has responded, I would classify it in terms of three strategies, right? So Beijing has responded by retaliation, by diversification, and by securitization. So, and there's a mix of pragmatic calibration and political campaigns in these, amidst these three strategies, right? In retaliation, I think that's where we see the most pragmatic calibration, right? In responding to the Trump era tariffs, the Chinese government sought to respond in kind to the extent that it could. It could not always respond to the full extent of the American tariff escalation, but it was careful never to go beyond that. It was careful not to escalate the tariff war. It has at the same time sought to diversify a lot of its economic relationships, right, by investing in and implementing the regional comprehensive economic partnership, by signing either new FTAs or upgrading new free trade agreements with a range of different countries. So Singapore, New Zealand, Cambodia, Pakistan, and so on. So diversifying its relationships beyond the United States. The third strategy, the third response of securitization is the one that worries me the most, and the one that I think leans towards a style of policymaking marked more by political campaigns than by pragmatic calibration. In ongoing research with some co-authors, I've been tracking the language in Chinese media articles related to science and technology over a 15-year period. And what we're finding is that from 2018 onwards, there's a dramatic increase in these articles of language related to decoupling. So self-reliance, chokeholds, technology self-sufficiency, independent and controllable. And what's interesting to me is that when you see the language spikes, corresponds quite closely to the various waves of either tariffs or export control restrictions coming from the United States, right? So their reaction is quite clear in the media. And we also see the reaction on the policy side. So tracking policies that have been coming out from the Central Committee, from the State Council, and from the legislative arm of the party state. And across all of these three dimensions, we also see an increase in policies emphasizing self-reliance. And I think this marks a growing shift in the way the Chinese government perceives globalization, right? Shifting from looking at globalization primarily as a source of opportunity to increasingly viewing globalization as a source of vulnerability. So this leads to securitization, and we see the securitization of the economic agenda being formalized at increasingly higher levels. So in the release of the 14th Five-Year Plan in 2021, we saw Xi Jinping in his speech using the term security 17 times, right, in a fairly short speech, right? This is in contrast to the 13th Five-Year Plan where security was there 5 times. And what's more dramatic is that in the 5-year plan, right, security became elevated to the same plane as the economic growth agenda, right, where Xi Jinping emphasized that security is a prerequisite to development and development is a guarantee of security. So by the time the 20th Party Congress rolled around, what we saw was a formalization of trends that had been building for a number of years now. The CCP altered its overall assessment of its external environment, right? Shifting to note that China has now entered a period where strategic opportunity coexists with risks and challenges, and uncertainties and unforeseen factors are arising. We saw this proliferation of the security framing across a number of different domains, right? From traditional security to non-traditional security, national security, system security, ideological security, energy security, economic security. I mean, you get the idea. So what do we make of securitization? I think that this is where the risk of political campaign as a major form of response might outweigh pragmatic calibration. In the media articles that we track, we see that the threats coming from the United States are being perceived and responded to in highly nationalistic language, where the quest now for technological independence is framed in the form of a national struggle. We see that word struggle emerge a lot against these external hostile forces who are out to contain China. So the overall response, again, is a mix, right? There's retaliation, there's diversification, there's securitization. It's the securitization that worries me the most.
So speaking of the elevation of national security concerns in the economic relationship, the US and China are undeniably on a pathway towards decoupling as the relationship moves in a more competitive direction. Yet at the same time, the two countries recorded record levels of bilateral trade last year. So how sustainable, in your view, is this dual reality? And you talked a bit about this pragmatic calibration that Beijing and perhaps the US has also exercised in trying to manage this decoupling. So how far do you see decoupling go? Do you think it's possible for the US and China to stay deeply integrated in some areas while while decoupling in others?
I think that's a great question. And honestly, where it shakes out is not entirely clear to me, right? We see the shift in the policy rhetoric and the threat perceptions, but in terms of the overall balance between integration and decoupling, right? I think if we look at diversification and securitization, if you put that together, right, that is China's dual circulation strategy, right? It is not seeking to completely cut itself off from the world, right? It's this relative balance, but I don't think that it's possible for the party state to actually optimally calibrate the correct balance between the two, because what is the optimal balance, right? If you ask different actors within the party state, they'll have different ideas of what the optimal balance is. And I think how it shakes out will be, on the one hand, I think it'll be dependent on three factors, right? First is the overall stresses on the economy. The more that the domestic economy deteriorates, the more that the leaders will be forced to take the economy seriously as a primary priority. Secondly, I think it depends on the overall political contestation, right? So the elevation of security into the economic agenda, no doubt gives security agencies within the bureaucracy greater say over the economic agenda. So it'll be a product of that political contestation to which we're honestly not very privy to these days. And it'll also be dependent on many of the local governments, right? How willing are they to embrace dual circulations? How willing are the coastal cities to embrace dual circulations, where their very source of success depends on there being rich and dynamic flows with the external economy? And I think the third factor, right, comes from the United States. Right? What is the United States government's overall policy towards China? I cannot actually articulate that, right? I know the individual components which have been articulated by Anthony Blinken, right? There's align, there's invest first, then there's align, and then there's compete, right? Invest is about the domestic American economy. Align is about the partners. So only compete is directly related to China. And compete is not a strategy, right? It's sort of more of a stance. And absence, I think, a more coherent articulation of the type of relationship that the United States government seeks to establish with China, what is happening is that actors within the Chinese party state are interpreting all of the actions coming from the government in the form of strategic competition as a policy of containment, rather than competition, right? That is how it's being interpreted. And when it's interpreted in that way, it fuels, right, the political campaign as a reaction rather than pragmatic calibration to the real risks that many governments, right, not just China, the United States, many governments are figuring out how to make their domestic supply chains more resilient in response to the COVID pandemic and so on. So I think that is a real source of uncertainty, and it's not entirely in the control of the Chinese government. I think the balance between the two, how the US is reacting to China, how China is reacting to the US, is also really important to figure out.
Yeah, those are really important points, and I hope we can unpack that further. What is the U.S. strategy towards China? What more can the U.S. be doing to signal, to send the right signals to Beijing? But on competition, Alana, I want to turn to you. So Yaling just discussed many of Washington's, or she touched upon some of the export control policies that we've seen. The ones that that were just announced last fall were based on this premise that it's imperative for the United States to maintain as large of a lead as possible when it comes to certain foundational technologies like semiconductors. And this is particularly important. The argument has been made when you're dealing with a competitor like China that practices civil military fusion. So I just want to ask, how effective do you think US tech export controls on China's chip industry are in the short to medium to long terms? And what do you think might be some of the unintended or unexpected consequences we might see as a result of these policies in the future?
Well, maybe I can take a step back and kind of situate this latest round of policy interventions in kind of a grander systemic sweep. I think broadly speaking, we're entering a phase, or we are deep in a phase rather, of intensifying bipolarity, in the sense that the US and China are approaching the status of pure competitors in many dimensions, broadly defined, not just the size of GDP and let's say military power in East Asia, but also by other indicators like the size of their respective R&D spend, for example. So the two are growing in a more alike. At the same time, the distance between these two countries and the rest of the pack is widening. So the United States and China are much bigger spenders in R&D than third, fourth, fifth countries globally. So there is this kind of positionality in this intensifying bipolarity, but at the same time, I think that we're seeing elements or the early indicators of beyond that a kind of convergence or isomorphism in certain aspects of basic policies or basic features of the US and Chinese systems, including the government industry interface and how the government acts in the space of innovation and technology policy. In terms of I think that's kind of the big picture sweep. Now, these very specific measures, the short and medium and long terms, implications, I think, are still actually quite difficult to assess. I think that I have studied the aerospace industries for a long time. And when I compare those traditional hardware intensive metal bending industries to the semiconductor industry and IT, I am absolutely awestruck by the enormous complexity and dynamism that you see in an industry like semiconductors. So I think one speaks about even the short term with great trepidation, actually. I think there are two big dimensions. One is, on the one hand, some of these unilateral US measures can be quite devastating in the short term. They can be quite devastating in a relative medium term. In the very short term, a lot of US export control restrictions have not actually been implemented to the fullest. And there have been a lot of carve-outs for US companies. There also have been some accommodation for other foreign companies that use US origin technologies and are therefore bound by the same export restrictions, like, for example, South Korean companies. So we haven't seen the full impact of what all of these export restrictions actually implemented and enforced would look like. So we'll see that in some kind of medium term. And in the medium term, unilateral action by the United States can certainly have a very, very significant impact on the prospects of individual Chinese companies like, say, Huawei. Beyond that, over the long term, there is, of course, a well-established and I think increasingly urgent Chinese effort to domestically supply and develop the technologies on the critical path in any industry identified as strategic, but certainly in anything related to electronics hardware, anything related to IT. These efforts will, over time, I think we can expect them to be largely successful, even though they may never completely duplicate the kinds of technological capacities that have been available in global supply chains. From the US perspective, over the very long term, or the long term, I should say, multilateralizing export controls is essential. So we see now the elements of what is sometimes called an emerging plurilateral export control order, in that we see instances of the United States teaming up with a small ad hoc coalition of other countries that are home to companies with critical high-tech capacities or facilities to enact specific measures for set periods of time. So the recent US agreement with Japan and the Netherlands to restrict the most advanced node semiconductor technologies and their movement to China is an example of this kind of plurilateral arrangement. So I think that may foreshadow a longer term trend. It is, in the grand scheme of things, necessary for the US to multilateralize or plurilateralize these efforts for them to have the kind of impact they're intended to have. And I should say, when we measure the success of export controls from the US perspective, I think it's very important to be realistic about what export controls can ever achieve. I think they're often described as this sort of crippling measure that will decimate a Chinese industry. I don't think people who are sensible or knowledgeable about export controls ever expect them to have that effect. Typically, the first objective of US policymakers who are developing export controls is to ensure that US companies are not complicit in the modernization of China's military or the strengthening of China's defense industrial base. So the goal is not per se a global technology denial regime that contains China, although that can certainly be understood to be one of the effects of these moves. But really the extent of their reach, policymakers' reach, is insofar as they can regulate US companies and the US origin technologies that those companies possess. And so their main goal is to ensure that US entities are not actively undermining long-term US national security objectives. And the second consideration I'd say deserves more recognition or attention is that no one expects export controls to be completely hermetic and achieve complete denial of a given US origin technology to Chinese actors, say. But they are expected to slow the development of Chinese industry, to restrict access. So not to completely change the course of China's technological modernization or to really fundamentally eliminate the existence of some industry in China, but probably to slow its development, to make it more costly than it would otherwise be, to maybe divert resources from one sector to another. So the impacts, I think, properly understood, can only ever be relatively incremental, even though they can appear dramatic for short periods of time. Export controls are a very limited instrument.
Thank you. That's a very interesting picture that you painted. And despite the limitations of export controls, the expectation is that the chip export controls are sort of the first in a series of others that we can expect. And so what are some other areas where we might see new restrictions? And can you talk about the implications for high-tech sectors, whether here in the US or in China or in other countries, as these restrictions pile on, and what kind of reactions we might expect from Beijing?
I think, again, sort of systemically, I think exactly as Yeling said, we are seeing a securitization of the economic relationship, which is to say that trade flows that were once thought of as economic or commercial phenomena are now understood primarily in terms of their security implications and are become targets of security policy, not just economic or trade policy. That tendency, in a sense, exists on both sides. I think you see both sides, both the US government and the Chinese government categorizing or characterizing a growing number of sectors as having, being pregnant with national security implications or being essential in some sense to the development of a future defense industrial base and so on. What we understand to be at work or afoot in Washington now is an extension of some of these export restrictions or this type of export restriction to biotechnology, for example. I mean, that represents, I think, a very significant change. When we think about the origins of the US the US export control regime has historically always been about technologies that are quite directly tied to weapons of mass destruction. And the life sciences, while certainly of tremendous economic consequence, have never been approached in this way before. I think there's much to lament on one level about the securitization of the relationship and the fact that biotechnology and these different areas, we'll probably hear something similar about solar panels and other forms of technology that we consider at some obvious distance from defense, I think in the coming years. But there's a lot about that that's problematic for the relationship. But I think on a more fundamental level, we're long overdue for a kind of reassessment of how we think about what count as dual use technologies and what don't. On the one hand, a limitless securitization of every technological sector is obviously problematic and not constructive. On the other hand, a lot of the kind of regulatory architecture that we've had so far has rested on this neat compartmentalization of what counts as commercial and what counts as a defense technology, what counts as a single use or a dual use technology. And I think in practice, that is actually no longer tenable. I mean, the paradigmatic example is semiconductors. There are obvious ways in which commercially traded technologies are essential to the defense industry and defense manufacture. And it is very difficult to try to characterize some of these technologies as purely commercial, even though they are overwhelmingly used by commercial end users around the world. So we're in a space of kind of churn where I think we have to redefine how we compartmentalize, how we draw a boundary between what should be strictly regulated and what shouldn't. And I think we're going to see some like evolving discussion on that front, but undeniably, we're seeing a broadening of what counts as deserving restriction.
On that point, zooming out a bit and thinking about these challenges from a broader values-based perspective, how should we think about the placing of export controls on inherently dual-use items? So you started to get at this, like semiconductors, which are indeed a critical component in high-tech military equipment, but they're also essential for items used in everyday civilian life, like cars to smartphones. So how do we square such measures with other American values and ideals in the free and open movement of people, ideas, and commerce, all of which have been foundational for the United States' success, especially compared to more closed systems like China's? It's a big question, but
Yes,
it'd be great if you could tackle it, and perhaps we can discuss more during the discussion.
Yes. Such a modest and manageable little task. There's so much more to say about this, but let me just say that I think there's a big conceptual and intellectual divide between how a lot of political economists and trade theorists will look at this question and how a lot of innovation policy specialists will look at this question. The United States, yes, professes, of course, a commitment to free trade and open borders and et cetera. On the other hand, the American system, while never explicitly embracing top-down industrial strategy, does have a very elaborate and sweeping but fragmented system by which the government does actively support innovation in many different technical areas that are deemed to serve the public interest, whether it's defense or agriculture or whatever else. And I think we're probably on the cusp of a kind of renegotiation of how we understand free trade in this context. I don't think the way forward is less specific industrial supports, less government intervention in support of innovation. That is not the way major national pieces of legislation are going. It's also not the way US agencies from, again, the Air Force to the Department of Energy to the Department of Agriculture to OSHA actually interact with industry. And in fact, right, and because there are so many efforts to actually actively support technology development with public monies across the American system. So I think what we're more likely to see is a redefinition of the free part of free trade. We're likely to maybe see a reappraisal of how industrial strategy is imagined in the American context, how it's reconciled with these longstanding ideals. So it's a kind of in a very exciting and dynamic time, and there's probably a very interesting role for scholars in helping to kind of articulate a vision for what responsible free trade looks like in the future.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alana. I'm going to turn now from US-China tech competition to another heightened area of attention and friction, and that's on Taiwan. And Scott, we're going to turn to you. So several American military leaders have made public predictions of timelines for when China might invade Taiwan, with the US Air Force General Mike Minahan most recently predicting a war in 2025. So, to start us off with the easy question, where are these timelines coming from? And more broadly, why have tensions risen to the degree that they have in the Taiwan Strait in recent years? And do you think a military conflict is indeed on the horizon?
Yeah, so clearly the relationship has gotten quite tense in recent years. It's gotten a lot of attention. We saw this especially kind of with the Pelosi visit to Taiwan last August, where not only was there kind of a lot of pretty strong rhetoric coming from the PRC in response to that visit, but also a series of pretty provocative military exercises. Oh, I'm sorry. But also kind of a series of pretty provocative military exercises. And more generally, we've seen over the last several years and a pretty sharp increase in PRC military pressure against Taiwan. We've seen this evidence, for example, with increased incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, circumnavigation of the island with military aircraft, an increased willingness to send fighters across the midline of the Taiwan Strait fairly recently. And this in turn has kind of, I think, fed into some of the speculation that we've seen recently about possible kind of increased risk in the not too distant future of military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, so where is this tension coming from? Maybe first, I think it's important to kind of highlight a couple of kind of underlying sources of tension in the Taiwan Strait. And so part of it kind of is, I think, kind of a result of what we might term kind of growing differences between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait concerning kind of the core issue that's in dispute, right? So that the core issue that's in dispute in Taiwan is basically whether Taiwan is or should be kind of thought of as a part of China. So it's an issue that's basically about Taiwan's status and identity. And so on the one hand, if we kind of look at kind of at the societal level, right, we've seen kind of some divergence, especially on the Taiwan side, over a number of years now. We've seen kind of declining interest in unification with the PRC, even as kind of a long-term aspirational goal. We've seen kind of growing identification of Taiwan citizens as kind of Taiwanese rather than as Chinese, or even both Taiwanese and Chinese. And even though kind of the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, I think has been quite pragmatic in her approach to cross-strait relations, certainly much more pragmatic than her DPP predecessor, Chen Shui-bian, who was president during the 2000s aughts. Unlike her immediate predecessor, Ma Ying-jeou, she's been unwilling to endorse any version of kind of this idea that Taiwan is in principle a part of China. And this in turn has kind of led the PRC to kind of ratchet up its coercive pressure against Taiwan. On the PRC side, I think there's some evidence that Xi Jinping as well is kind of less patient on the Taiwan issue than his immediate predecessor. And we saw this even before Tsai became president, right? He kind of indicated, I think as early as 2013, that he thought that this was an issue that should not be passed down from generation to generation. So I think some of the reason that we see this kind of increase in tension is basically fundamentally kind of some increase in kind of differences in the way that the two sides have approached kind of the core issue that's in dispute, which is kind of, again, Taiwan's status and identity in recent years. But I think it's also important to kind of note that there are elements of, kind of a reaction, an action kind of reaction cycle in the Taiwan Strait that in some sense, I think kind of resembles a security dilemma, especially in kind of US-China interactions with regard to Taiwan. And this kind of, I think, adds to the volatility of the cross-strait relationship. In recent years, kind of as we've seen this kind of ratcheting up of PRC military pressure against Taiwan, that's again, is it kind of occurring against a backdrop of rapidly improving overall Chinese military capabilities. We've seen efforts by the United States and Taiwan to improve bilateral security cooperation, right? And this is evidenced in, by kind of a number of things, increased high-level meetings and dialogue between the two sides, increased security coordination, changes in kind of the rhetoric that Washington sometimes uses to describe Washington's relationship with Taiwan, and so forth. And in Washington, this is generally viewed, I think, as reactive to what China is doing, as kind of reactive to this kind of growing PRC threat against Taiwan, as evidenced by this increase in coercive military activity, but also kind of reactive to kind of the overall increase in PRC military strength. And we've seen kind of calls in Washington for the US to do more. And again, it's kind of in reaction to kind of this threat posed by the PRC. But it's important to note, I think, as well, that in China, there's also, I think, a tendency to kind of frame what China's doing in the Taiwan Strait as reactive to what's going on in Taiwan and the US-Taiwan relationship, right? So as kind of reacting to what's seen as kind of a change in the status quo under Tsai Ing-wen relative to her predecessor, but also kind of a reaction to this kind of deepening US-Taiwan security cooperation, which is concerning because there's, I think, a belief that if this kind of proceeds to a certain point, it effectively kind of enables Taiwan's long-term separation from China. So I think it's kind of complicated, and I think that the increase in tension is kind of a reflection of both kind of increased divergence in kind of the underlying preferences on kind of core sovereignty issues between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, but it's also kind of reflective of a little bit of kind of an action-reaction dynamic in the US-China relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think the action-reaction cycle is indeed sort of driving this downward spiral. And many parallels have been drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan's respective predicaments, and preventing Taiwan from becoming the next Ukraine has become a real topic of concern for leaders in Washington, in capitals across Asia and Europe. Would you say, Scott, that the lines that are being drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan are helpful, or if they're accurate? And what would you say are some of the key similarities and some differences between their two situations?
Yeah, so my personal view is I think it's really hard to draw a huge amount of inference from the war in Ukraine to the situation in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, there's superficial similarities between the two cases. In both cases, you have an authoritarian power, in the case of Ukraine, kind of invading a democratic neighboring country, in the case of Taiwan, kind of threatening a democratic neighboring state, and so forth. But I do think that it's that there are kind of limits in kind of how far you could kind of carry these similarities. Obviously, the U.S. relationship with Taiwan has been kind of a lot different. The US has kind of expressed a lot more interest in Taiwan security for interest, kind of, going back a much longer period of time than with regard to Ukraine. And you can kind of go on and on. Obviously, Taiwan's an island, ... So, there's limits, but that said, I think that the war in Ukraine kind of illustrates a couple of things that have relevance here. One is that war is certainly something that's not obsolete in today's world, even among states that are highly integrated into global markets. And so I do think it sends kind of an important kind of warning about the fact that even though and to come back to your first question, I don't think a war in the Taiwan Strait is likely in the near term, but it's something that I believe could happen. And the war in Ukraine, I think, kind of illustrates this, that wars still are certainly not obsolete, even among countries that are integrated. And it also kind of illustrates kind of the stupidity of war, right? And the stupidity of kind of invading a neighboring country. And it illustrates kind of the risks and the costs that are entailed and the uncertainties of kind of fighting a war. And in that regard, I do think that to the extent that it has kind of direct implications in the near term on the Taiwan Strait, it's a hunch. It's not a certainty, but my hunch is that it's probably induced kind of a greater level of caution in Beijing, just because it illustrates pretty clearly how things can go awry.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, speaking of the stupidity or the costs of war, it's clear that the outbreak of any military conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be devastating for everyone involved, first and foremost for the people of Taiwan, for China, the United States, and everyone else, really. And so what steps would you recommend the major parties be taking in the subsequent months and years, Beijing, Taipei, as well as Washington? What steps should they be taking to lower the risks of conflict and to really preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I won't say as much about Taipei and Beijing, just because I feel it's a little presumptuous for me to kind of make policy recommendations, although other than to kind of suggest that it's important to maintain some level of pragmatism. And I would hope that Taiwan's got an election coming up next year. It's not clear what's going to happen, but if the DPP stays in power, the hope would be that you continue to have kind of the sort of kind of cautious, pragmatic approach that we've seen under Tsai. For the United States, so I think that there are kind of a number of things that the United States can do, and they kind of relate to each other, right? So on the one hand, it's important for the United States to maintain kind of the capacity to deter a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So kind of maintaining kind of a robust military presence in the region and so forth is critical to kind of deterring Beijing. But I think that there are two really important addendums to that. So one addendum kind of relates to work that Professor Christensen, right, is something that he's kind of emphasized going back to the 1990s, right, in his writings on Taiwan, which is that a big part of deterrence resides in assurances, right, making credible assurances to the party that you're trying to deter that their worst case kind of fears aren't going to be realized if they don't do what you don't want them to do, right? And in the Taiwan Strait, this basically means that the United States needs to make continue to make clear to Beijing that it does not have a policy of that basically kind of encourages Taiwan's permanent separation from China, right? And so and what this means in kind of practice, I think, is not doing things that are effectively kind of gratuitously poking Beijing in the eye on the Taiwan issue. And we can talk more about what that means in kind of specific examples in the Q&A. The other kind of point, the addendum to kind of maintaining robust deterrence, I think relates back to kind of some of the points that Yeling and Alana were making concerning kind of where the PRC is kind of going in terms of kind of its broader development strategy. I think it's kind of important to note that the PRC is deterred in the Taiwan Strait, not just because of the potential military costs and risks associated with a war in the Taiwan Strait, but the broader kind of costs that a war in the Taiwan Strait would entail, for example, for Taiwan's development model, right? And it's kind of the implications that a war in the Taiwan Strait would have for Taiwan's or for China's kind of ability to remain kind of integrate into global markets, what it would mean for the broader US-China relationship, including the US-China economic relationship. And it almost certainly would make all of these things much worse, and it would kind of intensify by a great deal kind of pressures to pursue decoupling and to kind of wall off China from the global economy. But I think it's important to note that, so in recent years, we've been kind of drifting in this kind of direction where the US is kind of pursuing a decoupling or something like a decoupling strategy vis-a-vis China. And we've seen kind of this intensification of kind of pressure on China and almost kind of a scorched earth approach to the bilateral economic relationship. The concern is that this kind of approach leads China to kind of pursue its own kind of, a more kind of a policy, a development strategy that's kind of more grounded in self-sufficiency, and one where there's kind of a sense that China has less to lose if a war were to break out in the Taiwan Strait. You have a China that basically has kind of less of a stake in a stable status quo. So I do think that it's important for, deterrence is really important, but it's also important for leaders in the United States to try to avoid, a full kind of scorched earth kind of policy of confrontation with the PRC, and to seek areas of cooperation where it's possible, and I think to kind of avoid kind of an all-out decoupling strategy.
Great, thank you, Scott. You bring up an important point that Taiwan is a core interest of China's, but it's not the only core interest. And so we need to think about how, what are China's other priorities, how might those motivate China to play in a more stabilizing way. Isaac, I'd like to turn to you next and ask you about the situation in the South and East China Seas. It seems like because so much global attention is on Taiwan, we hear less and less about what's going on in these seas where China has expanded its presence. It continues to jostle with its neighbors with whom it has territorial disputes. Quite strikingly, we've actually seen more naval exercises between China and Russia in these seas in recent years. And so can you give us a sense of what's happening in this South and East China Seas at present and how China's naval presence is evolving?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Patty, and thanks so much to Tom and Ian, to SIWPS. This is such a wonderful group, and I'm learning so much and always love the chance to speak with all of you. So thank you for that. And I'm glad to have a question on the South and East China Seas. It seems like all anyone wants to talk about is Taiwan and the B word. And there's nothing about the old that old stalwart of the DC conversation. But as those in this room will know well, it's intimately linked to the Taiwan problem, South China Sea and East China Sea, in terms of conceivable campaigns and operations and roles of various players. And certainly from Beijing's standpoint, they are. And I think one of the reasons we now see this momentum and these predictions from various general officers and flag officers about impending conflict has to do with some of China's successes in the South and East China Sea on a military and strategic side of things. I don't think it is the case that they've completely succeeded in achieving some of the things that they set out to do. These 20 years ago now, Andrew Chubb is sitting here, has really tracked the development and some of the origins of this greater assertiveness of China in the maritime domain. And if we think back to this era, 2006-7, of some of the things they were trying to accomplish, a lot of those have largely been achieved. In the South China Sea, certainly the more visible and concrete side of that is they've built up quite capable facilities across the entire expanse of the South China Sea. It could not be said until relatively recently that China sustained significant capabilities in the southern part of the South China Sea and could routinely just operate there and deny fishing, oil and gas, potentially military and aerospace access, at least ISR capabilities down there. This is all a relatively recent phenomenon, and that in large part is the full realization or consolidation of a lot of these investments that China's been putting in place in its maritime space over this long period of time. In the East China Sea, I suppose I'm old enough to remember when that would have been the biggest subject of conversation around the period 2010 to 2012, 13. Things were extremely tense there. And there as well, I think it's fair, if sort of disappointing from a strategic competition standpoint, to conclude China's normalized its presence in and around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, including in the territorial seas, undermining the basic premise that Japan maintains while denying the existence of a sovereignty dispute, that it's effectively under the administration of Japan. This is the nature of our treaty obligation to Japan. We've reasserted, especially in that period, 2010 to 2012, when it came up to the level of the president, that we needed to express our security interest there. But this, I think China has created the problem that they intended to, and hasn't pushed very hard on that issue in large part because of that. They've undermined the de facto reality of Japanese administration. They can realistically say, we partly administered the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. And so I guess these are all, we can talk about how this connects to Taiwan. I'll just sort of leave that out there as a interesting and important strategic element of why this space is important. But I guess at the same time, and I really appreciate you plugging my book on this, because it's very much focused on exactly this question, or some part of this question, which is to say, how is it working? Is China actually succeeding in changing the rules, or are they developing a new maritime order in East Asia? And I guess to preview the book, which is available in a box back there, and I believe we can give them away to interested parties. I'll be delighted to see it in any of your hands. If not,
Sign me up.
absolutely. But what I'm looking at there is the empirical patterns of China normalizing some of this presence, normalizing the expectation among other states that this is what China is going to be doing. And I think that's really something that we can observe quite clearly now. It's very difficult for the Vietnamese to exploit fisheries and oil and gas in the southwest part of the South China Sea. And they're coming to the conclusion that they can no longer, for example, allow or extend contracts to Russian or Japanese or Spanish or other oil and gas firms, even because China's effectively demonstrated to them that it's not going to be worth it, to the Vietnamese as well as to these foreign partners. And I think that's just one small anecdotal example of a broad range of ways in which China has now consolidated a lot of the effective control, they often call it. Xiaokongzhi is the sort of term that people were circulating around early in this, of like, this was the strategic objective. I don't think they have achieved the goal of making it a Chinese lake, or of fully denying things that America and its allies would have to do in this theater, but consolidated control, I think, is a fair conclusion.
Great. Well, alongside or in response to China's expanded naval activities in the region, we've also seen the strengthening of security ties between the United States and its allies, and the growth of new pacts like AUKUS, or we could even look at the most recent announcement between the United States and Philippines to grant access to 4 additional military bases to U.S. forces. And much of this activity has really been driven by regional concerns about China's aggressive military posture. So how would you say that the strengthening of these ties between the U.S. and its allies, or among U.S. allies themselves, are shifting the military balance in the region? And would you say that these upgraded or new pacts are helping to stabilize the region, or are there perhaps risks that we should also keep an eye on?
Let me try to take a swing at this from the perspective of Beijing. I don't know if I'm qualified even to assess the balance, or whether or not that's going to be successful or sustainable, so much as I think what you have identified here is, from Beijing's perspective, a very unfavorable set of dynamics, unfavorable set of security dynamics in the region. And this is a room filled with students of Chinese foreign policy. The U.S. alliance network, specifically the U.S. posture in the first island chain, has long been a source of great distress for China, and the consolidation of those alliances rather than the wedging apart of those alliances, which has been a major foreign policy goal for China, is obviously unfavorable, and I think colors a lot of the very dark assessments and language that we've heard from senior party leaders over the last cycle, and I expect to hear again in March during the Lianghui, just about how severe and grave, and think of all the adjectives that they pepper into these discussions about the international security environment and trends in that. And so I think it's hard to miss the long-term strategic implications of configurations like AUKUS, and the ways that is putting similarly long-term strategic pressure on China to develop itself militarily and in terms of its relations with other states in the Pacific in that case, as just introducing a much greater intensity to their assessments, of course, of how challenging their security environment is, demonstrating that they haven't done enough to break up the U.S. alliance system, and in fact, maybe have been counterproductive in the ways that they have sort of catalyzed and triggered greater alliance cohesion or alignment. And so, yeah, I think we're sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop in some ways on what is Beijing's likely reaction to this. Of course, they're going to build up their own military capability to deal with what they perceive as a growing, an increasingly robust American, particularly maritime power projection capability that they view as encircling them. But again, that's nothing new. This is an encircling problem. All of these maritime policies and strategies that I was talking about in response to your first question are very much motivated by that fundamental reality. And I think it's not a good, I don't mean to be too much of a downer on this, but that's not a good place for us to be for China to assess the security trends to be deteriorating and requiring them to take some additional actions to reverse it or stop the further consolidation of American alliances. And so basing in the Philippines, that's quite an acute version of that. They certainly would view as a policy win the difficulty of the United States sustaining any kind of even rotational deployments there. If they're expecting now U.S. to really be based there, and if they're watching as the U.S. and Japan really find their footing in terms of how they want to posture specifically on the Taiwan question, which I hope we'll come back to, that U.S.-Japan dynamic is something that China's quite worried about, and I think in some ways tees us up to see more tension in the East China Sea, or China to back Japan off of its increasing commitment, I think, to U.S. strategic objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan. So.
Great. Well, speaking of encirclement, one relationship that really has coalesced around this disgruntlement with encirclement by U.S. allies is the China-Russia strategic alignment we've seen come together over the last decades. And it's been really striking to watch how close these two countries have become, and to see sort of how they see parallels in their respective situations, with Russia sort of bristling at NATO expansion in its sphere of influence, and China pointing at the United States and its allies for encirclement in East Asia. And it's been really striking to see Beijing double down on its so-called no limits partnership with Moscow, despite the many global reputation costs it's paid, even after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And last week, of course, we heard breaking reports that China may be considering supplying lethal weapons to Moscow, although it has yet to take that step. And so I want to ask, how concerned should we be of this partnership between China and Russia? We mentioned that they've been doing some joint exercises in the East Asian region. Do you ever see this alignment posing a serious military threat in the Indo-Pacific region? And alternatively, do you see a potential for Beijing to serve as a moderating force on Russian aggression, or to otherwise play a more constructive role than it has thus far as the war in Ukraine continues?
It's clearly a profoundly important question, and I will only have some limited insights into it. But basically, I think, a no limits partnership doesn't look so great when that partner is very weak and getting weaker, getting more and more distracted. And I think, as Scott put it, is being stupid. You don't, and I think that would be Beijing's general assessment. I don't think that they think that Putin or the Russian military campaign have been very sound and strategically effective. And if you're standing back to back, as they put it, with a person who's collapsing, that's not a source of stability, I guess, is fundamentally the problem. And so this question about whether or not it's in Beijing's interest to militarily support and to really to cross what I think is about as clear a red line as the U.S. government has issued on this question. If you look back to February 2022, that's basically what all the senior national security officials were saying, is under no circumstances should you support the military capabilities of the Ukrainians. That's going to constitute a red line. We're going to react, I can't remember exactly the words, with the Russians, and promise some grave consequences. And obviously they are now talking about it as though it is in fact happening or might happen. I don't know, but I'm worried about the fact that that's the storyline so far. We laid down a marker. We're saying they stepped over that marker and it's going to justify some.
Well, not yet.
We're saying that they might, and they're thinking about it, which is, yeah, it's a very good way to tease public attention and media interest and to create a storyline and maybe even a Netflix miniseries on it. But I'm certainly watching very intently because it would be a fateful decision for China to do this quite overtly. And they don't seem to want to do that. I'm worried about daring them to do that. But you know, I will be watching this very closely. And I guess just to tack on one additional element of this, military cooperation is not necessary for China to gain some military advantage from its relationship with Russia now. And I think that may be one of the vectors that it is going to be easier to discern over time, which is to say, because Russia is weak, because Russia is dependent fundamentally on China's good graces in some ways, they're going to have a much harder time saying no to China on a lot of things that China's been asking for from Russia. And some of those might be military technologies. So again, this would be strengthening China vis-a-vis Russia as well as the West. But then also access, to include commercial access to things like major infrastructure projects in the Arctic. Various things that are going to position China strategically, which they certainly intend to do, to project more power in Europe, to feel more secure, to provide something like a big brother type backstop to Russia even. And I assume that'll be one of the ways they market it to them. We're strong and we can deploy a lot more capability here. And to the extent that we now exercise together, as you pointed out, in all sorts of places, to include in the US EEZs off Alaska, you know, there's lots of scope, I think, for that type of military cooperation. And I don't have any way of making a prediction about whether or not they will open up the overt sales of military materiel to the Russians. But yeah, I'm curious what other people think about this.
Great. Well, on that note, we have about 30 minutes left, or maybe a little less, or no, just about 30 minutes left for this session. And so I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and we can unpack some, we only touched the surface. I feel we covered a lot, but there's just so much more we can go into. So hopefully we can unpack some of the questions that came up. So would anyone? Yes, please. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be wonderful. Great. So question about North Korea. Why has North Korea disappeared from the conversation? And what is China doing about North Korea, if anything, or how are the US and China thinking about North Korea? And then the issue of human rights issues as well. So would any of you like to tackle one of those? And we could also start.
I volunteer you for the North Korea.
Well, I want to play moderator. Am I allowed to participate?
Please.
Okay. And maybe while I address the North Korea question, if anyone wants to tackle the human rights angle. I mean, on North Korea, I think it's quite depressing where we are. North Korea is clearly continuing to expand its nuclear and missile arsenal. And there's just no political momentum or anyone sort of willing to go out on a limb to do something about this issue. And so I really think it's the sleeper issue in the area. All eyes are on Taiwan, on Ukraine for good reasons. But again, I think we're seeing this rapid nuclear expansion, and I think that's going to have consequences for the region. In South Korea, serious people are actually talking about getting their own nuclear weapons. There's a lot of concerns about US extended deterrence guarantees and whether it's sustainable in the face of North Korea really ramping up its own nuclear program. So it's really not in anyone's interest to leave this problem alone, but unfortunately, it's just really depressing. I don't see any fresh ideas coming out of Washington, Seoul, Beijing, or anywhere. And North Korea is one area where the US and China arguably have a lot of common interests, but the fact that we're not able to get together to talk about what to do to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula is quite striking, and it just speaks to where the US-China relationship is today. But I'd be interested to hear from the panel if you have any thoughts there, and also on human rights issues. But Alana?
Well, it's really more of a question for people who actually study this topic. But when I look at North Korea and Russia, I see some interesting parallels for China. In both cases, you have a very difficult junior security partner. Can we put it that way? And I would be really intrigued to hear from those who studied the China-North Korea relationship, what kind of lessons Beijing might have drawn from the kind of brinksmanship and other strategies that we've seen from Pyongyang, and how it may apply those to managing its no limits partnership with Russia. You know, what are the limits of a comparison between a Putin and a Kim Jong-un or a Kim Jong-il? I'm sure there are many, but is there any value in thinking in that way? And how do the decision makers in Beijing possibly see that?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And how much cost is China willing to pay to keep these strategic partners close? And how do you balance that because China is really doing this as it's looking at long-term competition with the United States. It feels like it needs to stabilize its borders, but at what cost, right? And I think that's a great way to put it. Anyone want to address the human rights angle? Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, Alana. Or sorry, Yelling.
I mean, the way I think about it, it's if we think about the various events and drivers that has led to this shift in US-China relationship, right? We have to factor in developments in Hong Kong. We have to factor in the repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I think very unfortunately, it narrows and diminishes the available political space for the two countries to find common ground. I mean, I think there are some ways in which I think the overall reassessment on the United States government side is perhaps misplaced. And that for me, because I study the World Trade Organization and the economic relationship, I think some of the conclusions there can be reassessed, but that's not the only picture, right? And I think it's just, bringing that angle in it is really important. And I think it helps us understand why it is so difficult to find any kind of balance in that bilateral relationship right now, because we don't see Beijing willing to acknowledge that piece of the relationship or to make any gestures towards wanting to have a conversation on that.
Yeah, it exacerbates the situation in Taiwan, right? If you kind of look at the public opinion trends in Taiwan, kind of like views of identity, there's a huge spike in Taiwan-centric identity around 2019, like as the protests and then the crackdown in Hong Kong were occurring, right? And so there's relevance, right? Because the one country, two systems, right, is the proposal still in place for dealing with the Taiwan issue, and it doesn't have any credibility because of what's taken place in Hong Kong.
I guess I'd just tack on of the foreign policy implications of these human rights issues. I think it's especially salient in Europe. And I think they're somewhat less instrumental and cynical about the way human rights fits in, as Yelling was saying, is sort of crowding out any possibility for cooperation in US-China relations. I think China was really counting on Europe being more cooperative and open to them. And I think the fact of Hong Kong and Xinjiang and the fact of China's effective support for Russia, of course, on top of that, has really made that quite a long shot. And I think the human rights issue plays very, very significant role in how Europe is likely to continue to address the China problem increasingly. It's the way they characterize in European capitals.
Yeah. Yes.
Just very quickly bring it back to export controls and say that Of course, a broadening understanding of security provides the basis for broadening export controls on the one hand in the American system. But on the other, of course, we have had longstanding human rights-based legal instruments that have also restricted technology exports to China. And that, of course, has expanded in the wake of revelations about the role of Chinese technology firms in the repressive machinery in Xinjiang and so on. There is, of course, other ways in which that manifests too. There is, for over a decade now, a federal law that bars NASA from bilateral cooperation with any Chinese entities. And while that's not an export control per se, it's a measure that's intended to restrict any possibility of technology transfer. And its actual basis is not really in direct security concerns, but primarily in human rights concerns and in denying Chinese entities the kind of symbolic reward of cooperation with NASA until there's measurable improvement on the human rights front.
Great. Great. We have a question right here in the front, please. Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions if you don't mind. One, I was reading a report by McKinsey and it said that meat consumption in China is driven to a sign of, middle class interest. So do you think like some kind of liberal democracy is possible in China in 3 years? Two, there are about 66,000 businesses, foreign businesses in China. How can they navigate the possible war environment in Taiwan? And do you think with the CHIPS Act in the United States and Japan, decoupling and trying to produce their own chips and decoupling from China, the support to Taiwan is decreased within the American government, because one of the reasons why we want to protect Taiwan is because of chips. And if there are sufficient here, you think the interest of supporting this goes down.
Great, thank you. Lots to unpack there. So the role of the middle class, and as China's economy grows, is there a potential for China to move in a more liberal democratic direction? International businesses in China and how they're navigating the tensions due to the Taiwan or the situation in Taiwan or Ukraine. And then this issue of diversification of supply chains, especially in the chip sector, and whether that takes away from Taiwan's Silicon Shield. Perhaps that's something that Scott wants to address, but anyone, you could step up first and go ahead. Scott, do you want to go first? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'll start with this kind of the second part of your question and let someone else talk about prospects for democracy in China, which I don't want to delve into that. Yeah, no, I think so. You raise an interesting point about whether kind of U.S. security interest in Taiwan might decline somewhat if the U.S. is successful in really kind of diversifying a kind of a chip supply that doesn't like have supply chains running through Taiwan. And first of all, just kind of note, like, even if this, like, over the long term, like Taiwan's importance in kind of terms of kind of producing high-end chips were to decline, this would be kind of a long-term kind of outcome. It's not something that's going to happen in the near term. And so it's not something that's kind of an immediate possibility. Secondly, I think it's important to kind of note that I think U.S. security interest in Taiwan is much broader than this kind of concern about chip supply. I think that that's one kind of facet of kind of why the U.S. is an interest in Taiwan security. And more generally, I think I would kind of frame it more as kind of there's a shared U.S.-China interest in avoiding war in the Taiwan Strait because of what it would mean for global supply chains, right? And so this is something that would have big implications for the U.S. economy, but it would also have kind of huge implications for the global economy, including the Chinese economy, right? And so that I think that's important to know. It's not just kind of a U.S. interest in Taiwan security because of its role in chip production. It's because Taiwan's so important. A war in the Taiwan Strait would have potentially catastrophic economic consequences that would affect not just the United States, but also China and countries across the world. But I do think that the US interest in Taiwan's security is a lot broader than kind of this concern about supply chains, and has to do with kind of broader, like what the broader implications of if the PRC were to actually invade and occupy Taiwan, what that would mean for kind of what sort of kind of country that the United States was kind of facing in bilateral competition, what it would mean for the balance of power in the region. And then kind of more broadly, I mean, Taiwan's a democracy, right? And I think, you know, coming back to kind of the point about human rights before, I think that there is a sincere kind of interest in seeing that protected in the Taiwan context. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yang or Alana, do you guys want to address the business part or any part really of the question?
So on the question of an emerging middle class and democratization, if I could, I think I'd like to broaden your question a little bit and bring in the international angle as well, and this perception or argument or consensus in Washington that engagement has failed, right? So the engagement rationale was based on two things, right? First, liberal international, the ideas of liberal internationalism that, you know, that it is possible using multilateral institutions to peacefully integrate China into the global economy, and that through economic growth, as you mentioned, an emerging middle class, right, and these external channels for cooperation that would ease the way for China to democratize domestically, right? So it's a combination of liberal internationalism and modernization theory. And I think that the conclusion being drawn these days that engagement has failed, right? Therefore, both of these premises don't have an intellectual ground to stand on, deserves a lot of reconsideration, right? If we think about China's process of joining the World Trade Organization, right? Now the consensus is we should never have let China in, right? I would propose a counterfactual. What would China look like if it had not joined the World Trade Organization? If we look at China today, where is it easiest, right, to where is the rule of law strongest in China, right? It's in the economy, right? Where has there been built up a set of lawyers and discourse and practice and skills that are in line with international practices, right? It's in the legal sphere and it's in administrative law in the economy. Which would not be possible for so many foreign businesses to even operate in China absent that, right? The degree of change that the central government in China invested in to build up institutions that would support a market economy was extremely strong in 2002, 2003, 2004, and so on. Yes, it did fade over time, but that is also partly because of the deadlock happening at the WTO itself in terms of how to construct another round of liberalization that would bring gains to the developing world, right? The Doha Development Round ultimately failed. So that decline in momentum, right, had a domestic effect as well in terms of whether or not it could empower those who wanted to see a more market-oriented China and China continue to be built up, right? That fed into a decline in momentum in China as well. On this relationship between the middle class and democracy, I think, you know, here I'll just draw on research of other scholars, right, who have shown that the pathways are not that straightforward, right? So your traditional sort of lip-set argument would be that an emerging middle class is more urbanized, is more cosmopolitan, it's more educated, it will have this bottom-up change. But we have to be concerned not just about the level of wealth, but also the distribution of wealth, right? And there's research out there that argues that the more unequal a society is, right, which China is today, right, the less likely it is that the leadership, right, the autocratic leadership would see in its interests to liberalize, right? We also can draw on other sets of literature that look at pathways to democratization in Asia, right? So in places like Korea and Taiwan, and scholars like Dan Slater and Joseph Wong have argued that, you know, when democratization has happened in the Asian region, it has been when the ruling party has been in a position of strength, rather than weakness, right? And right now, I would argue that the CCP sees itself as quite in a highly defensive position and in a precarious position vis-a-vis the external economy, vis-a-vis the international system, and with a lot of stresses and domestically as well. So all of those factors have to be brought into bear, right? Not just the middle class.
I think those are excellent points. Lana or Isaac, do you want to tackle any part of that question, or should we? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Ian.
Tom and I agree on almost 90%. On how much academic speculate about policy. For most of us academics, most of us looked off our policy. But what I detected from all of your presentations were kind of working with ideas. And, you know, roughly there are three simple models. One is security dilemma model. One is basically one or both countries. The third is this argument that there is this mobilization, nationalist mobilizing. Those obviously have different implications. Slow down or what do you want to get? So I'm interested in sort of what is the model that we need to use working with, and what are the broad and
That's a very big question. I feel like I'm back in grad school, Ian, but it's wonderful. It's forcing us to look at our assumptions. Does anyone want to tackle that question? What model are you working with? Perhaps it's all of the above, really, and there's elements of all models. But what is that? What implications does it have for how you think about recommendations for stabilizing this relationship?
I think because I think like my thinking is the most straightforward, and so I can quickly relay the essentials of what I think is ultimately a pretty simple position on this. I guess I think my mind probably lives at the domestic politics level more than anywhere else. In the following sense, I think fundamentally, not everything, but a large part of what we see in the bilateral relationship, including in this long-term, bumpy and uneven, but long-term trajectory toward decoupling, is traceable to domestic choices. And I think while there have certainly been external aggravators, I think that China's leaders have for at least half a century now had a very, very strong commitment to technological self-reliance. And that even at the height of reform and opening, in sectors deemed strategic, there was always the understanding that a linking rails with the international economy, opening to the outside world, was a tactical step toward ultimately securing some form of technological invulnerability or some form of technological self-reliance in those sectors. I think we don't acknowledge that enough. Actually, China has charted its own course in many, many ways. We overlook forms of Chinese intention and Chinese agency in this kind of long march toward technological modernization. It is certainly a way of thinking that's been shaped by external shocks, including China's very unpleasant experiences of being denied important technologies by the Soviet Union, by the United States. But this is a very, very long-term, fundamental domestic, ideological, political commitment that I think it would be very difficult to dislodge or change for anyone on the outside. I don't know. I don't think the US should really be in the business of suppressing China's flourishing and development. But insofar as there is a strategic competition in which the US seeks to maximize its power relative to China on a wide range of dimensions, then I think actually there's big picture, very little the United States can really do to limit China's rise. Certainly the development of its economy, the fundamentals of a country of, 1.4-ish billion people, the enormous size of the market, the tremendous advances in human capital and so on, that all these basic fundamentals are very, very favorable to China. And actually, I think the levers that the United States can use, big picture, are very, very limited. So for me, it really comes down to keeping our own yard neat, our own side of the street clean. And the most important conversations we should be having are not about US-China competition, but really about what the United States can do to revitalize itself, revitalize the US economy, reconsolidate and recommit to democratic institutions. What are the domestic sources of US strength that need to be cultivated and focused on? And I think that's kind of missing from this entire conversation. That's also where the greatest potential for actual impact lies. So, yeah.
Isaac?
Sure. Thank you, Ian, for a really challenging way of framing this. One of the reasons that I like to come to events like this, and I'm now trying to learn from people like Tom and Patty about how to, derive some policy implication or policy preference from some of the research that I'm doing. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I guess when I think of these three implicit models for what's driving deterioration in the relationship, I think maybe this is intended in the way you framed it. Their implications, or they prescribe possibly contradictory policies on the part of the United States. So thinking about security dilemma, it prescribes reassurance, I suppose, would be a big way to break out of that problem. And yet, if you think it's a model of hegemonic competition, and I guess specifically China displacing the United States from Asia being the feeling driving US policy, and I guess if I were to allocate relative weighting, I think that's probably the center of mass in the US blob now. Then it obviously means resistance to China's efforts to achieve hegemony in East Asia, and possibly a counter offensive against it, which is a very different set of policies than reassurance. And in fact, recommends that you don't reassure them. You should threaten that you might do that. And then finally, if it's a domestic nationalist story, then the prescription is domestic subversion, peaceful evolutioning them to change, whatever it is. I'm not one who expects liberal democracy to break out, regardless of the levels of meat consumption in the Chinese middle class. It just doesn't. Yes, that's right. The interactive nationalism problem. But thinking about this in terms of, well, if that's your model analytically, what does it recommend you do from a policy standpoint? And I think it's, you got to get those nationalists out of power in China and empower our liberal democratic friends who are just waiting in the wings, according to, I guess, implicitly according to that theory. So I don't know, I'm left with, these are contradictory impulses and strategic objectives, and which model you adopt obviously is quite consequential there. I worry that the hegemonic competition one is the most easily understood. It's the one that has caught on most quickly, and it's the one that recommends by far the most escalatory and destabilizing set of policies. So on that happy note, I'd be interested to know what other people
Yelling, did
think.
you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ian. That's a really thought-provoking question. I love it. To me, I see some interesting synergies between the security dilemma model and the domestic politics nationalism model, right? In the sense that the threat perception is framed not just in material terms, but in terms of national identity, right? Which leads us to interesting conclusions or implications for what should be done to escape a security dilemma, right? If we think about what sorts of combinations of threats and assurances need to be put forward, right, to escape a spiral, right? These threats and assurances need to be not just material, but ideational as well, right? So the assurances, which have been quite lacking, right, need to be not just about immediate tactics or actions that the US or China will or will not take, but again, goes back to this question of what is the relationship you wish to establish with this other country? How do you perceive that other country which feeds into the perceptions of nationalism domestically as well? I think it's a very difficult switch to take place because these nationalisms are in opposition to each other and they're framed in opposition to each other, right? So if we look at the American situation, right, I absolutely support what Alana said, right? Why should the conversation and the perceptions about what constitutes national strength in America be defined by this other, right? Be defined by the need to outcompete China. Why not invest in American workers and labor and industry for its own sake, right? If the American government stands for a rules-based order where American companies should not be investing in other companies that might violate human rights, why not make that a principle across the board? Why does it have to be about one specific country? So if an American company invests in another, right, non-Chinese company that also violates human rights, is that somehow okay? Then, right, that isn't a rules-based order, right? And it feeds in, why is that the new national identity now? So I think shifts both domestically in terms of the conversation, right? The political conversation within America about what constitutes American strength needs to change, right? And reshaping the way we think about how to construct threats and assurances beyond the material realm also need to take place.
Thank you. And Scott, I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just say a couple of quick things in response to your question, Ian. So first of all, as someone who's happily ensconced in academia, I generally try to avoid the policy recommendations kind of world. So I just wrote like a couple 100-page book on Taiwan, and I shoved like policy recommendations into the last like couple paragraphs, right? So that's kind of point one. But regarding your kind of three models, I think it is, and again, I say this as someone who just kind of, in the book, I basically thought analytically of cross-strait relationship, of the relationship as basically a continuum, and argued you could kind of make all these kind of arguments based on this very, very simplistic kind of model of cross-strait relations. But that aside, I'll just kind of say it's dangerous to kind of simplify in terms of kind of these three ideal kind of models because they bleed into each other, right? And so you could kind of say, yeah, so there's action reaction that might kind of be a consequence of security dilemma dynamics. And so you have kind of both sides kind of taking, building up military capabilities, engaging in military exercises, strengthening alliances, whatever, right? But that then feeds into domestic debates and it makes it easier for nationalists, right, on both sides to make their arguments in the context of domestic political debates, right? And that can take on a life of its own. So I think in reality, it's really hard to kind of separate out these ideal models from each other.
Thanks, Scott. This has really been a terrific panel. We've covered so much ground, from the US-China economic relationship to tech competition to Taiwan to the South China Sea and China-Russia strategic alignment. It's just really breathtaking, the ground that you've covered. And so thank you to all the panelists. And what I really love is this ability for CWP to get together and think about big theoretical questions, but at the same time, also think about really practical policy recommendations. I think that's the real sweet spot that CWP has. And it's been fantastic. I'm looking forward to the next panels as well. Would you join me in applauding the 4 panelists up here?
That was great. Yes.
Thanks, Patty, for leading a great panel. Thanks to the panelists.
I just got here about 45 minutes ago on a train, but I got here, but I have slides. Good morning. Okay.
Yeah, I'm a ringer. I haven't prepared anything. I don't teach you that. But that's it. Control. Okay.
Should we start?
Yeah, please. You just take over. You're
Okay. So, hello, everyone. Okay, good. Chairman Tom. Okay. Okay, hello everyone. My name is C&WP. I teach at the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm also a CWP fellow, former fellow, not. It's my great pleasure and honor to moderate this afternoon's panel, Great Power Relations or Great Power Politics in Asia. So we have 4 distinguished speakers. I will first make a very brief introduction of these speakers. Then I will sort of say a few words before we engage the discussions. So first, Professor Peter Clement, he's the interim director of Salzman Institute of War and Peace. He's a top expert on Russia, previously served in US government on a variety of positions. So we would be very pleased to hear his opinion about China-Russia relations. Then Curtis Fong, she teaches at the Macquarie University in Australia, previously University of Hong Kong. She's also a former CWP fellow. She's a top expert on China's relations with United Nations. So we would like to hear her opinion. And Dr. Christina Lai, she's a fellow, a research fellow at Academia Sinica, 中研院 in Taiwan. And she's expert of Chinese security policy, China's economic, statecraft, and cross-strait relations. Last but not least, Professor Tom Christensen, he's a director of the China the World program. So our topic today is, as I said, great power politics in Asia. As a student of international politics, I think this topic is both exciting and depressing for me. Exciting because as a student of international politics, I'm very familiar with all these concepts like balance of power, great power relations, Cold War. So academically or intellectually, now we see these kind of people talk about these kind of great power relations, great power politics. Previously, we saw some of those ideas are outdated, but now they all come back. So, but as a people, as a human beings, this is really like a depressing era in a sense that when we think about great power rivalry, we really think about the world is really like it becomes more and more dangerous, right? So, but fundamentally, I'm an optimistic person. So how to be optimistic in the era of great power relations? My way to maintain optimistic is that I lower my expectations because I'm not a policymaker. I'm academia. I have zero impact on policy. So I always lower my expectation. My current expectation, borrowing Professor Christensen's framework, many years ago, he talked about whatever international security issues, there are 2 options, bad, worse, catastrophe. So now we will talk about great power relations. Now we're not talking about good relations. We're not talking about back to the old era of cooperation. We'll really talk about how to avoid catastrophe, right? So how
we should seek a bad outcome.
Okay, yeah. How to avoid the catastrophe. So that's my sort of like an introduction. So the first topic is about Russia-China relations. That's Professor Clement. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Or should I get this mic closer? Closer, okay. Thank you. Okay, is this better? It is, okay. Well, first, let me say thank you for having me today on this panel. Thank you all for being here. This is one of my favorite subjects. I teach a class on Russian security policy, and my big picture bottom line of Mr. Putin is his security has gotten a lot worse in the last year or two. And to me, China is a big part of that problem for him. I was debating how to start this today, and I thought I was going to flash up some PowerPoint slides of the BFFs, Putin and Xi at various meetings, toasting one another, Xi calling him my best friend. I mean, there's an incredible bromance that's been documented multiple times over the years, which I always found very interesting as a Kremlin watcher. And I was always a little suspicious. Only because I think in the grand scheme of things, Russia is clearly not at the same level as China. Yes, it has far more nuclear weapons, but economically, we all know where the real powerhouse is. And unfortunately for Putin, economics has a lot to do with a country's stature. So as I thought about the past year or two, you all recall the meeting on February 4th, about 2 weeks before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There was that wonderful meeting in Beijing, and they talked about this relationship without limits. And I did wonder at the time, well, about 3 weeks later, I wonder if Xi actually was informed about what was going to happen on February 24th. I've read some stories that suggest maybe Xi didn't get the full story, but nonetheless, it certainly gave Putin a little running room on the eve of the invasion. Rather than go into all the details of current events, though, the thing I really thought might be more useful for me and hopefully for you is to think way down the road about what are the broader strategic implications of this war and the relationship with China for Mr. Putin. And I'm sure you have all noticed that Putin has unilaterally declared war on the West, on Western culture. He's now obsessed with religion. He thinks he is the moral rector for the entire world, telling everybody what's right and what's wrong with morality. And he basically has affected, in my view, a divorce with the West pretty seriously. And this was evident, by the way, in pretty senior foreign policy documents in around 2011, 2012, in the Russian foreign policy concept, Putin described Russia as part of Europe. About 5 years later, in the same document, that phrase completely disappeared. You can tell I'm a little bit of a criminologist. I like to read all these long documents, but frequently they are kind of revealing about a little bit of the cues that the writers of these things must pick up from the senior leaders. Eugene Rumor and a colleague wrote a piece at Carnegie about 4 or 5 years ago now called "The Bear Hug is Real." I would argue there's no longer a debate about that. That bear hug is not only real, but it's much, much tighter because Putin has become far more dependent on China. Supporting data. Well, a couple of things that I think are very key indicators. Trade. Russian export to China in 2022 went up by 43%. 36% of Russia's crude oil and condensates exports go to China within the first 10 months of 2022. If you're a Russia economic expert, the thing you always look at is what's going on with Russian exports of oil and gas. An eternity ago, when I was a senior manager looking at Russian affairs at CIA, and this was in the Yeltsin era, the first thing I would ask at our morning production meeting is, what's the price of oil today? And invariably in the 90s for poor Yeltsin, it was usually in the double digits, sometimes in the 20s and 30s, $1 a barrel. When Putin comes to power much later, after 2000, you see those numbers go way up, and by 2006 or 7 or so, we're talking triple digit, $100 and more a barrel. That in part explains why Putin has had some pretty good measure of success in rebuilding Russia economically. The reason I cite the oil piece is because in terms of the health of the Russian economy, they're in the same place they've been for decades. And here's the problem. When you have an economy where 30% of your economy is tied directly to one export, energy exports, in my view, that's a very unhealthy, unviable economy. 40% of Russia's revenue from sales of goods abroad are based on oil and gas. The other critical part of this is when you look at the structure of the Russian budget, because 40% of it is dependent on that, you are extremely vulnerable. The reason I think strategically this relationship with China in the energy sector is going to continue to get worse for Putin. They've signed a long-term agreement on the Power of Siberia pipeline number 2, which is supposed to get underway soon and be done by the year 2030. In terms of strategic thinking and planning, that tells me Putin has very much decided I have to look east because the Europeans, he's gotten the signal loud and clear, they will never permit themselves to be in the same vulnerable position they were, particularly Germany, on Russian natural gas and oil. So this tilt, and to me, it's more than a tilt now. I think this is a full turn to China. There's very little room left here, I think, for Putin, if he remains the leader till 2036, if he survives, I don't think this relationship is going to have too many problems. Now, having said that, the thing I really enjoy about this relationship, perhaps because I'm hopeful that Putin has a little pain along the way here, is this is not a really good place to be for him. Putting so many of your eggs in the Chinese basket, that's a terrible metaphor, but eggs right now are very expensive here. I shouldn't go there, but this is not really a place you want to be. So I was thinking about some of the other issues that could create some tensions in this relationship. One of them has to do with geography. And I will confess, I'm a big fanatic with maps. And when I teach my unit on Russia, China in my course, the first thing I do is get a big map. And okay, does anybody know roughly how long that border is between Russia and China in the Russian Far East? Well, it's about 2,600 miles. And then there's a tiny sliver further west, but the real action is in the Russian Far East. Now, is that a problem? Not necessarily. This is not the most developed area of Russia, but there are a lot of people who don't live there. And for Putin, there's a demographic issue here. The Russian population on their side of the border is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million people. On the Chinese side of the border, near Heilongjiang, the population is 38.3 million. Now, is that a problem? I examine this, and a couple of scholars, Rep. Nakova and Harley Balzer at Georgetown, have written on this. When they dug into it in 2007, they said, yeah, not really. There's a great deal of fear. It's a political issue for some people, but there's not a huge mass migration. Nonetheless, some Russian politicians, especially conservative ones on the far right, for years and years, going back to Alexander Lebedev in the 1990s, who always talked about, quote unquote, the yellow peril in China. This is for some people a political problem. And I wonder whether this will emerge yet again, because in part of this dependence on China and the fact that the Russians desperately need to generate some population growth in the Russian Far East. One of the big indicators for me on why this continues to be a problem, in September of 2018, Alexander Gabuyev, who's a pretty prominent Russian scholar on Sino-Russian relations, wrote a fabulous piece in Foreign Affairs. And in it, buried in the middle of the article, again, you have to read all the fine print, he acknowledged that after the annexation of Crimea, actually before the annexation of Crimea, the Russians had conducted an interagency study. What would the consequences be of a big turn to China? They were asked to look at 3 questions. One was the population problem in the Russian Far East. The second one had to do with technology transfer and theft, if you will, on the Chinese side, about is there a lot of technology that's being stolen? And the third one, interestingly, was are the Chinese sort of making their way into our turf in Central Asia? Predictably, the answer to all 3 were, well, it's really not as bad as everybody says. For example, on the population side, yeah, there's about 600,000 Chinese in Russia. But when you look more closely, over half of those Chinese live in European Russia, not in the Russian Far East. Not such a big problem. On the technology side, the argument was, well, yeah, maybe the Chinese are taking some of our technology, but guess what? Within the next 10 years, the Chinese will overtake us in their technology gains. They're not going to be buying our stuff anymore. So the recommendation was, ironically, we need to sell as much as we possibly can, even of our advanced equipment, because soon the market's going to go away. Interesting argument. So you're getting the sense in here that the answer was kind of pre-cooked. They needed to come up with the right answers, but it's possible that that's really what they found. The third area, Central Asia, was perhaps the most interesting one, because in it, they said, it's great, China is doing more business with the Central Asian states. It means the Central Asian states won't be doing so much with Europe. This isn't such a bad thing. But at the end of that section, they said it was a real big red line. It said, the one thing the Chinese need to understand is they must observe all of our economic red lines. The most important one being, don't mess around with the trade relations that are directly created by the terms of the Eurasian Economic Union. In other words, don't undercut us in our trade market in Central Asia. That was a very clear red line. I reread that in the run-up to this talk today, because I was thinking, I would love to know if they conducted that survey right now, what answers they would find when we talk about Russian, perhaps leaning too much in the direction of China. My closing thought, the way I started, in my view, Russian security, ironically, Russia is now less secure than it was before Putin started this war. One of the obvious reasons is, rather than deflecting NATO and keeping it out of Ukraine, he has actually let NATO expand, since we are on the verge of seeing Sweden and Finland. Finland has about a 830-mile border, by the way, with Russia. So you've actually added a NATO power on a large piece of your borderline territory. Not sure how this is so helpful. Moreover, what Putin has done in his search for his this is my view, part of Putin's agenda here in Ukraine was to pursue his legacy as the modern day gatherer of the Russian lands. And ironically, he has actually created a greater sense of Ukrainian nationhood than existed before. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you have provided a very comprehensive analysis of China-Russia relations particularly from Russia's perspective. Now we turn to Courtney, maybe focus a little bit on the China side of the story, how China see this relationship, or put this in a broader sort of China's relationship with United Nations and others. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Xiaoyu, for the generous introduction, and thank you to Daniel, who actually is in the room to be thanked this time, to Ian and to Tom.
Thank you before. Every time I thank you.
For the invitation to join, and thank you all for making the time to join us today. I appreciate everyone's schedule, especially in a city like this, is always maxed out. I think like all, speakers invited on panels, I'm going to speak to the general theme, which we will be focusing on here is really, reflections on Ukraine as it comes back to sort of great power relations. And I'd like to do this by sort of focusing on my own research area, questions about how China is managing this problem in one of the most salient indicators for international opinion, which is politics at the UN General Assembly. The information is public, relatively transparent. The data is available to us all. I'd like to point out, I guess in my sort of opening comment, I think a point that's been raised by numerous, analysts of China's foreign policy, that the Ukraine question, for China at least, presents a very awkward series of contradictory ambitions. In order to try and maintain a relationship with broadly the West, made up of the United States and Western European players, Australia, New Zealand, and the like, not being caught as, quote, responsible for reigning in Russia, also not losing any potential benefits that it can milk out of this, no limits partnership. So again, whether or not this may be more suitable energy, acquisition, whether or not it may be potential arms sales, the question marks remain. And I'd argue, actually, it's a very important rhetorical opening. I know we worry about the real world and like actual material effect, but there is a much larger looming question about China's potential to actually become a global leader. And Ukraine, despite the fact that it's gone down at the moment, as obviously Professor Clement sort of indicated, the initial reporting about to what extent China may have known, been prepared, MOFA could actually address the needs of, Chinese, people within Ukraine. This still presents an actual rhetorical opening for China to reshape what the actual Ukraine question is really about. So on a tactical level, yes, we are watching a number of repeated abstention votes, frankly, in a variety of voting fora, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the IAEA, the list goes on, the UN Human Rights Council. The attempt to try and contain the Ukraine question for China in suitable fora. So again, this is not a matter for the IAEA, the UN Human Rights Council, for example. But there is a much larger strategic question about to what extent China can position itself as being this benign global leader. The most recent reiteration we've seen over the last week has really been the ambitions of this Ukraine peace plan. And again, a lot of China's efforts to reframe what it sees as a European affair, elites will talk about this, is now becoming a global food crisis, as becoming, sanctions gone awry. And so I think with that sort of broad opening, I'd like to point out, I think, two important things that sometimes we tend to forget if we follow the headlines, as this panel should be focusing on, great power relations in Asia, that there actually is a lot of variation within this pocket of the world. Again, we can all reflect back to the opening statements that ASEAN had a very hard time coming up with an actual statement, to the point that Singapore's might does not make right very clear position made global headlines, all the many months ago. We can also point to the fact that if we look at the votes that have just occurred, literally a few days ago, on the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine invasion, we can see that, states like India, Bangladesh, Laos, Mongolia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka also joined China in casting abstention votes on whether or not they would be willing to condemn this invasion. So I think, again, there's a lot of interest in sort of looking at China as this bellwether, but I think sometimes we forget that China is one of many states that has a question about the way that the language of global politics and the responsibilities of global politics gets dictated. Again, we can look at a much smaller set of outcomes at a much tighter group. The G20 could not come up with a unanimous closing statement. Despite India's heavy lift, it still ended up being the case that Russia and China kept to the position that the war itself was irrelevant for a meeting of global finance and central bankers, and that again, Russia and China refused to sign on to statements, quote, deploring the war in, quote, the strongest terms, asking for, quote, complete and unconditional withdrawal. So again, these aren't necessarily new things that have occurred just overnight. These are repeated positions that have sort of played out over the last year. And again, I'd just like to also point out my one last comment before I turn to my closing, that I think there's also been a lot of caution in the UN space that obviously operators aren't tone deaf and they're not stupid. They've been very focused on sort of reining in any potential types of resolutions. You have to hold your punches and you have to be careful about what you potentially put on the docket. So again, sort of this Western charge, and again, I'm talking about the United States, select states in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. They've been very careful to not use language about autocracy versus democracy. There is, a very clear awareness that this will not fly in a forum with 193 states. The UNGA, the language has been very targeted to talk about principles of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, foundational principles for all states, foundational in the UN Charter. This is very common language that China was very glad to stand behind. And if we look at these margins, the ability to signal condemnation is fine if we're talking about principle. So again, the UNGA votes, 139 states coming out and saying that, yes, we are willing to say that Ukraine goes as far as violations of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. If you want to up the ante, though, and start talking about really big questions about state responsibility, about accountability, and even larger looming question, then the pointy end of the stick gets a lot more complicated. And frankly, it's very lukewarm. Even South Africa is a peer leading, global South state, one of the big A3 that we turn to. Even then, their ability to try and talk about the humanitarian effects in March of last year fell flat. They got maybe close to 50 states. The real debate about climate adaptation and the food aid crisis has been a very interesting entree for China to join, to condemn this sort of long reach of sanctions, to condemn the fact that, the global food aid crisis that we're now experiencing, that you cannot make this simply a Russian question. There is responsibility from Western states that wants to push sanctions related activity. And again, on my last, data point to talk about this, when they talk about attempts for Russian accountability to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, only 93 states voted in support. 94 states in November of last year talking about support for a damages register. So this is not stuff that's necessarily going to fly. I will say, though, the one interesting outcome that perhaps had not been anticipated up front is that China has turned out to be a very important partner in terms of managing Russia's position at the Council. Yes, Ukraine is a hived-off problem. Yes, North Korea, as Patty knows, in far more detail than I, is a very big headache for Beijing. But China's ability to have moved resolution support to, ensure that there was greater support for Afghanistan, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find a Security Council diplomat that would not recognize the central role played by Beijing in terms of reining in Moscow's willingness at that point to actually move towards a veto. So again, there are these sort of movements by Beijing in order to hive off and protect its own reputation, arguably, that is leading to some more foreign policy dexterity in other parts of Asia that we may not be thinking about if we track the headlines. So with that, I thank you all and look forward to the comments coming down the line.
Thank you, Courtney. Now we move to Christina. So a lot of commentators, including news media, frequently mention today's Ukraine, tomorrow's Taiwan. But people in Taiwan and also in Beijing, they might disagree to various degrees. So to what degree this kind of analogy is useful or misleading, or how Taiwan, so the elites, people, policymakers think about the situation? So maybe Christina, you can.
Yes, so first of all, I'd like to thank Xiaoyu for moderating this panels on great power competition. So today I'm going to make some 3 points. First one is how does Ukraine war impact China-Taiwan relations? And second one would be Taiwan's potential missed opportunity to contribution to the liberal international order. And finally, I'm going to briefly talk about how would the United States kind of incorporate Taiwan into this newly established multilateral security network. So first one, how does Ukraine war have to impact China-Taiwan relation? I think when the war broke out, right, China likely assumed that the support for Taiwan would likely to be muted than the support for Ukraine has been, because this few country has maintained diplomatic relation with Taiwan, and many even reluctant to acknowledge Taiwan as a sovereign country. So I think in the case of Russia-Ukraine war, right, Russia has also leveraged its economic tie with some country to keep them on the sideline. So it's likely to kind of give China, reassure China that its far greater economic capability will probably prevent many countries from supporting Taiwan. And so what does China really want to know in this Russia-Ukraine war? I think like Putin, right, eager to bring Ukraine under Moscow control. I think Xi Jinping also worried that Taiwan is growing closer tie with the United States and its ally. So I think how Xi Jinping, interpreted or misinterpret the outcome of Ukraine send-off could really influence whether and how China can try to reunify with Taiwan. And thus it has a really significant implication for the regional security in Asia. And I think Taiwan Strait, we have known that it's been a potential hotspot for a decade. Right? And recently, tension has certainly increased as Xi Jinping routinely sent the air fighter, nearby Taiwan Strait, and also had held military exercise really close to Taiwan, in a clearly attempt to intimidate the democratic government in Taipei. And more importantly, Xi Jinping repeatedly talked of eventual unification, and his assertive stance certainly raised fear and worries in Taiwan. So that's basically how I think China's approach to Taiwan and what China really wants to know from the war. And secondly, I want to say about under the shadow of great power competition, right? How can Taiwan contribute to this regional stability and the liberal international order? China's rise in the 21st century certainly pose challenge and opportunity as the United States and the liberal international order. I think scholars in international relation and policymaker, certainly we already engaged in a heated debate over the nature of liberal international order and to what exactly to be maintained or be secure, right? But I think Beijing's economic coercion and military intimidation toward Taiwan might make Taiwan itself possibly the next flashpoint in Asia Pacific, and it could leading to a possible conflict between United States and China. So that's why I think the risk of conflict leading to even to large scale war could certainly, involve involve country in East Asia or even beyond, certainly cannot be ignored. But I think that's a main point I want to highlight, and also leading to my second point, right? Taiwan diplomatic isolation and its quest for legal status status certainly lead to this kind of important or very important, also very great puzzle here. So how can Taiwan, a liberal democracy in East Asia, can contribute more to a resilient liberal international order? Right? So how can the United States move beyond the bilateralism with Taiwan and maintain its competitiveness with China? So I think Taiwan's limited participation in international community is really a missed opportunity for a liberal international order, but it also presents itself a long-term risk to Asia's security in East Asia. So I just have a really offer my observation here. My view is quite straightforward. I think in order to achieve greater security vis-a-vis Beijing, I think the U.S. really need to embed Taiwan into this newly established regional network in fostering the resilient liberal international order. I think more specifically, I think the liberal international order will be greatly strengthened, right, if Taiwan is being integrated into the multilateral institution in Asia and beyond. And the chance of conflict in the Taiwan Strait will also be greatly reduced, therefore. So I think the United States really move beyond the current existing arrangement, especially focusing overly on bilateralism, and advocate a strong presence for Taiwan in the regional organization and the security network. And finally, it gets to my point on can Taiwan be a part of US-led multilateral network or not? Recently, we have been seeing that several multilateral institutions across Asia, such as Quad, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also AUKUS. So this kind of bring up to the reconfiguration of Asian regional security order. So I think this newly established security arrangement certainly carry on great strategic implication for Taiwan national security and regional stability. But I think in terms of US-Taiwan relation, there's a disconnect. The disconnect between US long-held policy of strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan and China's rapidly speed of military modernization. This kind of disconnect has to be resolved. And I think it should start with the recalibration of US policy toward Taiwan and US-led security network in Asia. I think this is right now, this is a really critical time for the United States to kind of declare strategic clarity toward Taiwan. And that's an official stance that US will respond firmly to Chinese use of force against Taiwan. And I think the shift from ambiguity to clarity will not only minimize the risk of conflicts in US-Taiwan, in US-China-Taiwan triangle, but also foster a stronger leadership in US leadership in AUKUS, in Quad, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But I think at the same time, US ally in Asia and Europe can somehow maintain a relatively ambiguous attitude that can help reduce the internal tension among the member states. I think this arrangement can not only help deter China's dominance in Asia, but also secure Taiwan's autonomy's democracy in response to Beijing threat of forced unification. So I think the combination of China's quest for greater influence and US desire to maintain its primacy and also packed with the emergent multilateral network. So these three elements makes the role of Taiwan, Quad, and AUKUS more essential both in academic work and policy debate. So I think in this sense, collaborative work between the United States and its ally can really provide a credible deterrence and substantive engagement with China. And also, most importantly, I think we need to think about how Taiwan can be embedded into the liberal international order and also the emergent multilateral security network in Asia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Now we turn to Tom to make a few remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Xiaoyu. I appreciate you including me on the panel at the last minute. I didn't prepare any comments, but we lost a couple of members for this panel by accident, and I thought I would step in and say some things about my own view about Ukraine in particular, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For the last few years, I've been working on two different projects. One is one many of you know about, which is a book about Jack Downey, who was an American CIA officer who spent 21 years in prison in China. But in addition to that, I was working on a project, multiple publications related to whether U.S.-China strategic competition would look like the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. And in 2019 to 2021, I made some pretty confident analyses that said it would not look like the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. And the three basic reasons was I didn't see China exporting its ideology abroad, trying to overthrow democracy and replicate its model abroad, even though I did see Russia trying to overthrow democracies and create authoritarian regimes where they weren't. Second reason was massive economic interdependence and transnational production chains that made it unlikely that the United States would be able to totally decouple from China, and even less likely that U.S. allies and partners would decouple from China. So you wouldn't have that kind of economic blocks like you had in the U.S. Soviet. And the third one's related to the first two, and that was that I didn't see real blocks forming. I didn't see the U.S. allies and partners that are the great source of American strength in a competition with China, and they still are, being willing to join in a kind of containment strategy towards the PRC for the reasons I just cited. And I didn't see China as having true alliances and true partnerships in the way that we saw in the communist world. So if you don't have blocks and you have lots of economic interdependence and you don't have ideological struggle all over the world, then where's your Cold War? That was basically my argument. I think Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and I wrote a paper for the Oslo Institute last summer, and it's, you know, it's part of an edited volume, so it should come out sometime in about 2035, in which I called into question my own logic, because I thought the Russian invasion of Ukraine was one of those world-shaking events, the biggest world-shaking event since the 2008 financial crisis, which I also think was a world-shaking event in the security field. And my basic take on it is this, you know, a lot of China specialists in the room, so you understand the analogy. I think it's the second time that the People's Republic of China was used, snookered by Moscow, changing its entire foreign policy portfolio. The first time was the Korean War. Kim Il-sung, in cahoots with Stalin, used Mao, tricked Mao into a position of supporting North Korea's invasion of South Korea with catastrophic results for China, including a million casualties, the loss of Taiwan, and the inheritance of North Korea. So they traded unification with Taiwan for inheriting an alliance with North Korea. That's not a good bargain. So how did they do that? You know, Kim Il-sung convinced Stalin that he could win. Stalin was nervous about it, but said okay. But he said okay conditionally. He did what bad parents do. He said, it's okay with me if it's okay with Mao. Right? So Kim Il-sung goes to Beijing and says, Stalin gave me the green light to invade South Korea. How can you help? And Mao didn't believe him. He said, oh, for 2 years, Stalin and I both told you you couldn't invade South Korea. Let me check with him. So he checks with Stalin, and Stalin says, I didn't say he could go. I said he could go if you said he could go. Thus, leaving the entire burden on China and relieving Stalin of any responsibility. So why is the Russian invasion of Ukraine like that? I think it's a total disaster for China's foreign policy portfolio. I think Putin tricked Xi Jinping into this big public statement about how they're brothers and how they're close partners, and great detail, long document, strategic partnership. And then he invaded Ukraine in a way that the Chinese did not expect. And this changed China's whole foreign policy portfolio because Xi Jinping, I think largely for domestic political reasons, somewhat for strategic reasons, could not distance himself from Putin after that exhibition. And as a result, for the last year, China has been walking a tightrope. It has been parroting Russian propaganda about the reasons that it invaded Ukraine, pretending that Ukraine was somehow a threat to Russian security, that, Russia was justified in the attack because of NATO activities, et cetera, thus making China look extremely bad in most of the developed world, particularly in Europe, by parroting this propaganda, basically justifying the invasion, but not calling it an invasion, not calling it even a war, just saying there's a conflict there, and it's basically the fault of the United States and NATO. This has gone over very poorly in Northeast Asia. It's gone over very poorly in Europe and really hurt China's interests. So on the one hand, why did I say it's a tightrope? They've been taking that position, refusing to condemn Russian invasion. On the other hand, Beijing has avoided giving significant material support to Russia after the invasion. Why? Not because China's instinct isn't to help Putin in his war, and not because principle, but because the United States and the other allies have threatened secondary sanctions against China. If it does so, that will speed decoupling, will hurt the Chinese economy. China's economy is still largely dependent on the outside world for all sorts of things, markets, for inputs. And China did not want to alienate the rest of the world in that sense. The problem is Putin's brutal and stupid invasion of Ukraine is failing. And the one thing the Chinese Communist Party fears most is domestic instability. And the one thing the Chinese Communist Party fears most is color revolutions. And you can be sure that in the inner halls of the Chinese Communist Party, they're afraid that Russia's brutal and stupid invasion of Ukraine will lead to a big loss of face for Putin internationally if Ukraine were to win, and that could have implications for Putin's regime at home, and he could fall from power, which would be a disaster for what the Chinese Communist Party translates into English as national security, which is really properly understood in Chinese as state security. As a result, it's going to be harder and harder for China to resist the temptation to assist Putin in the war so that he doesn't lose. And this is where we are this week. You saw high-level officials in the Biden administration making multiple statements this weekend about their concern that China is preparing to transfer weapons to Russia to assist it in the war. They claim that they don't know that it's already happened, and they claim that they're very concerned about it. I think the concern is very real. I spent a few days in Washington last week. The concern is very real. It's based on something that these people are reporting stuff publicly from what they're seeing in their own networks. They're saying what they see. These are CIA directors. These are secretaries of state, national security advisors, that there's something happening that they don't like. Hasn't happened yet. The problem is if they shut it off this time and China doesn't transfer the weapons this time, what about next month? What about the month after that, when more advanced NATO weapons go into Ukraine to restore Ukrainian sovereignty against the brutal and stupid invasion of Russia? I keep returning to that because we have to remember that's the context, a brutal and stupid invasion for no reason. So that's what China's inherited from Xi Jinping's best friend, Vladimir Putin. If the weapons are sold or transferred or given, I would expect a much harsher reaction from the United States and particularly the Europeans against China. We'll see a speeding up of the decoupling. We'll see a growth of the blockification of the world. And we will see something closer, unfortunately, to the US-Soviet Cold War than we saw before. And I think it's something that we're really right on the edge of. If you saw all those people go out, they don't go out on Sunday morning to go into the talk shows unless there's something really important, big moment. And you can pretend it's not real. You can pretend it's all fake. I don't think it's fake. I think it's real. And it's incredibly consequential. And if we go down that path, I think it will have implications for the likelihood of a US-China war over Taiwan. I don't agree with Christina's very well articulated arguments about the way the United States and others should treat Taiwan on the international stage, but I care greatly about Taiwan's security. And I think it will be a force for insecurity for everyone, including Taiwan and the United States. And it's a very pessimistic set of attitudes, but the ball is in Beijing's court. They have to decide whether the special relationship between two authoritarian dictators, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, is worth preserving at the expense of the Chinese nation and the expense of the world. And I know that sounds very melodramatic, but I mean it. And I think we're at a very important point. That's my analysis of great power politics in Asia. Sorry to be so depressing.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for the insightful analysis. Now I want to ask you a few questions. Maybe we can brainstorm how to sort of avoid the catastrophe scenario. So one thing I think maybe I will ask some question, maybe either addressing to specific speaker or maybe more open-ended to all. One is that looks like Peter, your description of China-Russia relations a little bit like asymmetrical. Increasingly, Russia is weaker and weaker. China is in a stronger hand. And Tom's analysis looks like Moscow is sort of take advantage of Beijing almost. So I was wondering whether, so this kind of like, on the one hand, Russia is so dependent on Beijing. On the other hand, Russia could put Beijing in such a difficult position. There is no way out. And by the way, I kind of disagree with Tom. I think China is not like how to say, on the one hand, China does not want to see Putin collapse, but I'm not see like a strong sort of tendency. Beijing has an interest to really supply military, provide direct military aid to Russia, because a lot of like a trade relationship is complicated. So my first two, maybe one question.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
Okay. Yeah. How you guys think about this? Like some people even think about the analogy. I see some Chinese analysis, China's foreign policy think tank. They're talking about Russia is like a giant North Korea now for China. So why you?
Yeah, it's a big North Korea. I like that. Yeah, such good friends China has.
Okay. So how about Peter? Yours?
Sure. Perhaps betraying my intelligence background. I told you earlier, I'm a little bit of a criminologist. I have to ask, why did Xi invite Lukashenko to Beijing for 3 days this week? Coming literally within weeks of Lukashenko's trip to Moscow, which was very awkward. I don't know if you've all seen the quotes. Putin says, gee, I'm glad you came. And Lukashenko says, well, I didn't really have much choice. Publicly, he says this. It's very awkward. And then, and I totally agree with Tom. I think the messaging and signaling coming out of the US is a little unusual, but it's very, very clear. They must have something there that suggests the Chinese are seriously considering some provision of whatever material assistance on the military side. So I'm wondering, how do you get out of this conundrum? How do you supply Russia but not really get caught at it? And I started wondering about Belarus. So in a weird way, if I were doing a little bit of a red cell, like strange scenarios, what if the reason Lukashenko's going there is, in fact, they're going to reach some kind of an understanding and material will go to Belarus. I don't know how you hide that, but somehow it gets there. And then because Belarus has some Russian presence there, things can make their way back to Russia. I'm being a little facetious here, Tom.
Poquito.
But I wonder, I do wonder if they're going to be thinking about Belarus as a cutout in the middle. I mean, it's so weird, but on the other hand, I kind of agree with you,
Iran
Tom.
is also going this week.
Well, of course.
They're another channel.
I saw that
Another fine friend.
the other interesting thing, there was one report in Spiegel that I came across. They have a source, I don't know how good it is, that says there's some kind of a Russian military conversation with a Chinese company that produces drones. Hard to corroborate that yet, but I wonder if that's also part of the puzzle here, that somebody got wind of this and it's actually accurate. And that may be what's driving this push now over the weekend to get these very senior people to say, don't do this.
Okay, so another question is about China's position. Currently, previously you did describe China's position is kind of similar to India and some other developing countries. So to what degree you think about China recently have these kind of like a peace proposal? Do you see some similar idea from other regional states like India, or do you think how do your judgment overall of why China try to propose this kind of proposal?
What do you think, Courtney? That one's for you, I think.
Yeah.
I think I've said enough.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd be curious to hear the feedback on the panel. I mean, but I'll take a first cut, and Xiaoyu's very ambitious question. I think there's a few things to sort of put into context. We have to think about, China's global engagement. Certainly its UN footing has been very securely placed on this idea that China has solutions to global development needs. It's alleviated poverty for millions of people. This is always the leading line. And somehow some type of economic salvation is always the precursor to other types of, so-called Western fixations to do with human rights, et cetera. I think we have to remember, though, that we have seen a shift in the last couple of months where China is now starting a new footing. We've had some chit chat, and unfortunately, Minya is no longer here to correct me about the Global Development Initiative. Of course, we've all been reading about the Belt and Road Initiative. Xiaoyu is, leading expert researching in this space. But there's also been this new edition of this Global Security Initiative. And this has been an idea floated, discussed, seeking to try and build some type of support for this new concept, this new initiative, rehatting offerings already given through the UN. Peacekeeping is now part of GSI. A UN Peace and Development Fund is now part of GSI. Attempts to have these bilateral, sign-ons about GSI with sort of the usual suspects, Cuba, the Philippines, Syria, and the like, is now part of GSI. GSI is meant to be China's answer to what it sees as sort of global disorder, and it's meant to be its security approach. It's still very broad and still very vague, but I would argue that in a lot of ways, being broad and vague is not necessarily bad. Big, ambitious initiatives in the beginning are, by that definition, broad and vague, and they will be filled and understood and populated by a number of elite groups, for example. But I'd argue that exactly this peace plan falls into part of this GSI offering now. And again, this idea that's been put forward, this sort of, I think it's like 14 points, broad, aspirational, there's not a lot of rubber hits the road, but there are these questions that common security is not so at the forefront of China's peace plan for Ukraine. There is reference right out the door about the need to respect territorial sovereignty, et cetera. But I think, again, the real question, as much as Tom says the ball is in Beijing's court, I think the question I'd be very glad to hear Tom's take is on, really what type of game is Beijing going to play? This Ukraine peace plan does not offer any condemnation for a violation of state sovereignty. It advocates for sort of, basically freezing where things are right here and right now, which everyone knows would be in Russia's favor. Obviously, in what may turn out to be a war of attrition where the Ukrainians have some real fight. Again, question marks over what would mediation with PRC characteristics look like, as again, repeatedly pointed out, China and many of PRC elites working in a number of, plum international roles will refuse to condemn Russia. So again, what type of peace plan is really being offered? And again, the broader question of where this goes, and I would argue that this peace plan, this GSI, while we may look at this, as I've literally just said 2 minutes ago, as sort of this first opening foot now where China is going to be posing itself as an authority regarding international security affairs, I think we still have to ask what type of authority China is resting on. And I would argue, at least, and this may not go down well with other students of Chinese foreign policy, but I would argue actually China's real expertise in resolving problems of international peace and security still remains quite thin. And I think that's reflected in part by what's been offered through the notions of GSI and this peace plan. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I'll say something about it's a peace initiative, really. It's not really a plan. I'm not correcting you. I'm just saying that it didn't have any kind of concrete elements to make it into a plan. it was kind of a statement about China's view on peace. I'll say that I don't think it was very meaningful. At the same time, I would have preferred if the United States had taken a position in diplomacy a little closer to President Zelensky in Ukraine and said, let's look at the elements, right? And then I would have held, if I were advising, I would have held China to task on the elements, especially the first element, respect for sovereignty. There's no way to have any respect for sovereignty as part of a peace initiative in Ukraine until the Russian troops pull out of Ukrainian territory. It's absurd to think that Ukraine should allow the Russians to rest, regroup, and rearm while they're on Ukrainian territory, and then we can talk peace. The second thing they should have latched onto was the non-nuclear piece, that nuclear weapons shouldn't be used. It's kind of obvious nuclear weapons shouldn't be used, but latch onto it and say, okay, you're targeting Russia with that. No one else is going to use nuclear weapons but Russia. So, take it for what it is. And then there was another piece about targeting civilians, which the Russians have been doing with great brutality, using very large scale weapons designed for other purposes against civilian neighborhoods. And China hasn't said a word about it. So, maybe take that and say, why don't you say something about your good friends in Moscow targeting civilians over and over again in Ukraine, instead of just talking about the vague principles. So I just think from a diplomatic point of view, you shouldn't just throw stuff out. You should use it against the writer, and you should turn it back on them. But it was just dismissed out of hand. And I think that's largely domestic politics in the States. But it's pretty clear what the problem is. The problem is a sovereignty problem, as it was stated. And the problem is a targeting of civilians, as was stated. And the problem is the threat of nuclear weapons, as was stated. And all of those problems emanate from Moscow. And China has quite a bit of influence over Moscow, and it's not using it. And I think that, again, the fear of criticizing Putin is very, very real, and it has to do with domestic politics in China in addition to realpolitik. And until China gets over that, the Chinese government will be taking positions that I'm afraid will hurt the Chinese nation. So I'm saying that as much out of sadness as I am out of anger. It's not good for China for this to happen. It's certainly not good for the United States for this to happen. And it's not good, I don't think, because I can see how this would play out badly in cross-strait relations. I think it's very bad for Taiwan, too, for this to happen. And I wish, to move forward, to try to make it a better place, is for Beijing to change its policies towards Moscow and say, this isn't worth it. This giant North Korea that we have aligned ourselves with is not worth it. It's hurting our national interest. And what worries me is that in the Chinese Communist Party, it's not the national interest that comes first. It's not the national interest that comes second. And it's not the national interest that comes third. It's the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm afraid that they've linked their fate to an authoritarian Russia in a way that harms China's national interest. I know it's depressing, just trying to be concise and honest.
Okay, maybe Cosley, then Peter.
Sorry, just one thing I should have added. It is actually 5 a.m. for me. So my mind is like catching up to where I am, but actually, no, it's 2 p.m. in New York. If I can just say one last thing, and I thank Tom for, pointing out again that it's not a plan, it's an initiative. Thank you, Tom. And for, there's very, obviously always for a guy that claims he's unprepared, always so eloquent. But I'd just like to point out one thing I should have said about this sort of GSI and this peace initiative. I do think at its heart that this is also a prompt offered by China. Elites have been listening, and part of this messaging, as complicated as things are, I pointed out that there is variation in Asia, that they have this ability to lean upon and let the heat also be taken by India with its very dense arms, relationship with Russia, plus its real ambivalence about what this liberal international order, stands for and represents, in terms of India's own national interest. I think at the same time, there is also this push that China is well aware that a lot of its messaging will not be working with a number of states, for example, as, Tom has outlined, the US questions. So again, not to say that this peace initiative and that this GSI is coming from this position of supreme confidence. There is, I would argue, a self-awareness that part of the message is definitely going flat. And so to be seen as saying things and doing things in ways that are respecting the principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, et cetera, is important. again, whether or not your rubber can meet the road, for precisely the reasons that Tom points out, is a, large, heavy question mark. But I defer to Peter. Thanks.
Peter?
Thanks. Just quickly, Tom, I thought you made some really good points that we might direct at the State Department. There were some interesting little openings here that might have been exploited and leveraged to put a little more heat on the Chinese, really, to put heat on Putin. The one person who seemed to pick up on your points was Zelensky.
Yeah.
He pretty quickly said, hey, I'd like to go and talk to Mr. Xi.
And he hasn't spoken to
And-
Mr. Xi in a year, which shows the Chinese position on the war. It claims to be like, where we just want peace, we don't take sides. They've talked to Putin like 1,000 times. They've talked to Zelensky 0 times in a year of a war.
So I do have one question for Tom, since I have the floor. But Tom, the one area where I think we could have an interesting discussion is if in fact the Chinese and Xi are focused on the importance of keeping Putin in power in terms of managing and sustaining the relationship. I'm not sure Putin is so critical. Whoever, if he were to leave, I don't think it would be because of Navalny or people in the street. He'd be undone by people on the inside, and the people on the inside who might get rid of him are not going to be big liberals. So I don't know that China would necessarily be hurt if Putin were to leave and we have a new conservative, but maybe a more realistic, less crazy, vision-driven person about his legacy than Putin.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, the way the CCP leaders likely see that process is that they can't afford to have the US and NATO join up with Ukraine and drive Putin out of office. That's a kind of a dangerous precedent in and of itself. I'm not so sure they're trustworthy of who would replace Putin and how friendly he would be to China in the future for realpolitik reasons. But I think the big problem is regime change by US and NATO force. This is something that brought Putin and Xi Jinping together initially, and Hu Jintao before him brought them together initially, was their common aversion to the US support for color revolutions around the world. And they're not alone in that. That's where I think Xiaoyu, they have a lot in common with a lot of the developing world, that this aversion to the US support for color revolutions. And Ukraine, before the 2014 original invasion, was one of those examples that brought Russia and Beijing and Moscow together. Was this idea that the United States was behind the Maidan revolution in Kyiv. So I think that aversion is very strong. I don't think they know how it's going to play out. And I think they worry about that precedent. I also think they probably have a healthy recognition that Putin will not go down softly, right?
Yeah.
And what does it mean if the best friend of Xi Jinping goes down hard? The United States has a tendency, and here's where I think the United States made a mistake. I think we made a mistake in the administration I served, George W. Bush administration. I think President Bush made a mistake when he made his Axis of Evil speech. Not that the members weren't evil, not that some of them were in Axis. I think one wasn't, but it was not. But that you don't have to say everything you think. I think President Obama made a mistake when he said Assad has to go in Syria. Which meant that negotiated outcome was impossible and getting a multilateral group together to lead to him. And I think it was a mistake when President Biden made a truly brilliant speech. And I don't usually use those terms for President Biden's speeches, but I think I'm not being snarky or critical. He's not known as a great orator, but I think he gave a great speech in Poland, not on this trip, but in his earlier trip to Poland. And I think at the very end, he kind of undercut the whole message by saying, and Putin has to go. And when you say Putin has to go, it strongly reduces the likelihood that you can get cooperation from Beijing and from many other capitals in your effort to pressure Moscow to change its behavior. If Putin has to go, that's an existential thing for the Chinese Communist Party. And even if President Biden believed in his heart of hearts that the only way this is going to end is for Putin to fall from power, I don't think he should have said so publicly. And I could tell from the presentation that it wasn't part of his notes. He had given a very, very fine speech and ended with that. And it's unfortunate.
Okay, now we have 25 minutes, so maybe we open the floor for questions. Patty?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
discussion. I have a question first for comment and then one for the rest of the panelists. Was there anything more the U.S. could have done to deter Ukraine this time? And I ask this because there's a growing common conception that basically undeterred by a regional dictator with imperial ambition. He was going to do what he did anyways, regardless of whether it was fair to NATO or not, whatever activity, because he wanted to make Russia great. So that's the question to you. And then to the rest of the panelists, whoever wants to pick up on this, I've been seeing a lot of lines being drawn between Putin and Xi, and this logic has been being applied to Xi, and Xi is just like Putin, another original dictator, and he says he's determined to resolve the Taiwan question. There's nothing the U.S. can do to really deter Taiwan or China from taking military action on Taiwan, and therefore anything other than preparing for this future military conflict is a sort of a crude argument that we see in some parts of the and so I think we should hear any of the thoughts.
Tom, I'll go first. Is that all right?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so what a fabulous question. And it's one that I've been wrestling with for a long, long time. So I have a sort of a long answer. Bear with me. I'll try to talk fast. I'm from Long Island. I can do that.
Oh, you're from Long Island too?
I am. I don't like to admit that. My undergraduates, I never told people where I was from when I went to school. I tried to change my accent. It's terrible.
Yeah, I didn't have the backbone to keep mine either.
So, okay, so hopefully a short answer. I actually believed for a long time that Putin was a fairly rational, smart guy. The way he marched through Georgia, Crimea in 2014 and Syria, this was really low risk, high gain stuff. Didn't put a lot of ground forces, very low casualties, relatively low cost. I got to test my new advanced weaponry in Syria. Crimea was a cakewalk. We got all these guys to the Black Sea Fleet, the little green men. This was hardly a war. And then you provoke the little thing in the east, so you have a territorial conflict that precludes NATO from considering Ukraine for membership. Great, great strategy. Then we have this invasion. And I was one of those who believed after I read the 12 July 2021 treatise on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine that the decision was made, Putin was going in. We had lots of debate about that. Is this coercion strategy if you say enough? And I said, yeah, that could be that. But when you keep piling on and you have 160,000 troops on the border by early 2022, to me, that's more than just a little coercion. That's a lot, and it's probably for a reason. So what happened between what I'm really asking, and my thesis is something happened to Putin between 2014 and 2022. And so after I read that speech and thought more about it, what led him to consider other factors that would make this dream come true? If you read all the Russian speeches for the last 20 years, he's obsessed with Russian history. I am personally convinced he really has been seized with this vision that I am Ivan III, the modern day gatherer of the Russian lands. There's a whole link to Solzhenitsyn, which I won't go down that rabbit hole, but there's another big nationalist. And so if you look at what happened in the world between 2015 and 2020, what do we have? We have breakfast. I'm clearly very hungry. We have Brexit. We have the US at war with itself. And Russia and Ukraine are part of that story, interestingly, but basically things are going so well for Putin. Then we have this virus. The Europeans seem more disunited than ever. The Americans under Trump kept saying, I don't even know that I believe in NATO. Putin looking around and saying, if I ever had a moment to pursue this dream that apparently he's had for a while, this could be the best time. I have a window of opportunity here, which may not last. The Biden administration was in 2021, but by now you see this buildup throughout 2021 of military force. For whatever reason, again, my personal view, I think he is so obsessed with this vision of himself and his role in Russian history. He wanted to reunite, and in my view, not all of Ukraine, the East primarily, and the land bridge to Crimea, that he saw this opportunity, and he had bad intelligence, believed he could do this in a quick, easy war. And of course, it didn't work out that way. So it's a strategic miscalculation of huge, huge proportion. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Okay,
So on Xi Jinping, I think he is deterrable. I think deterrence is complicated. I think he's harder to deter in part because China is stronger, in part because he's more ambitious than his predecessors, but I think he's deterrable. I don't think he's hell-bent on destruction or conflict. And I think a lot of the signals out of China have been misread. And this is a good opportunity. I have some different points of view from Christina. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been helpful in some ways for deterrence in cross-strait relations, in the direct military sense. And the person I consider the most reliable for conveying kind of U.S. government wisdom on these things just spoke about this yesterday, and it was in the papers today about cross-strait relations and Russia and China's lessons from Ukraine. And that's William Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a career diplomat of the first order, probably America's greatest standing career diplomat, but now he's director of the CIA. And he said the same thing, that it has to lead to some sobriety in China about the prospects of invasion because of the difficulty that what was a very respected Russian military in China. The Chinese really respected the Russian army in particular, and they've run into so much difficulty in what is arguably a much easier operation than crossing 100 miles of water and landing on beaches and then driving on the capital. So I think on that score, there's some lessons there. I think the Biden administration, again, I wasn't trying to be snarky before or hypercritical. I think the Biden administration has done a terrific job in responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of transferring weapons to make the Ukrainian forces stronger, and especially in terms of putting together a very broad international coalition. It's not just Europeans and it's not just Westerners. South Koreans are not Westerners. Singaporeans are not Westerners. Japanese are not Westerners. This is a global coalition of advanced economies and reasonable countries that are opposing the Russian invasion of Ukraine and punishing Russia for it. I think that helps deterrence. But again, we said it earlier today, deterrence has two sides, not one. You have to have a credible threat of punishment to the target if it behaves in a prohibited way. And in this case, the prohibited way would be attacking Taiwan. But you have to have simultaneous assurances that the other side will not lose its core interests, its core values, what it values most, if it doesn't use force. And where I disagree with Christina is I love Taiwan, and I've spent most of my adult life thinking about ways to make Taiwan more secure. I think that some of the proposals that she raised would make Taiwan significantly less secure. And on the question of clarity, which often comes up in American politics, the U.S. longstanding strategy of strategic ambiguity has been tremendously successful in a very dangerous situation. And I wouldn't want to tweak it because for the following reasons, going back to my IR theory framework, credible threats, credible assurances. On the credible threat side, the Chinese leadership and the PLA expect U.S. intervention in a cross-strait conflict. They don't ignore that possibility, not even by a small amount. They expect the U.S. to get involved. So there's no need to bolster the credible threat part of the equation by clarifying the U.S. commitment. And the clarification of the U.S. commitment will look in Beijing like the restoration of the U.S. ROC alliance, which was given up in 1979 and undercut assurances. And my rule on this is simple. You cannot deter a war by causing one. And I'm afraid that many voices in the United States, and this is where Ukraine is dangerous. People have drawn the lesson out of Ukraine that the biggest problem in Ukraine was that there was not a firm alliance commitment with Ukraine before the war. And if we had had that, the war wouldn't have occurred. Therefore, we should do that now with Taiwan. And I would offer to you my opinion that to do that now with Taiwan will cause a war across the Taiwan Strait because the mainland will become undeterrable under those circumstances. And I believe that the mainland is deterrable under the present circumstances. And the fact that the mainland is deterrable under the current circumstances, I believe is good for the United States. I think it's good for China itself, because I think a cross-strait conflict would be a disaster for China. And I think it's particularly good for Taiwan. And I close with my other statement about Taiwan, which is all Americans love Taiwan. Some Americans want to love Taiwan to death. And we need to be smart about our love for Taiwan and be prudent and strategic about what we do and don't do to help Taiwan. And I think we can pull it off. I think it's getting harder, but I still think it's possible. And I still think the likelihood of peace across the Taiwan Strait is greater than the likelihood of war across the Taiwan Strait. And I'd like to keep it that way.
Okay. Maybe-
It's ambiguous, strategic ambiguity, man. No, only in name. To date, it's only been in name, not immaterial. But I don't think they want to lose, so it may morph into material support. When it morphs into material support, the US and NATO relationship with China will fundamentally change in ways that will have implications for the entire world. And that's what I'm worried about. That's where we are right now.
Why this is such an important question, after which you think many people will follow that. What is categorically different in Russia? You're trying to provide with diplomatic coverage and all sorts of high tech tools and providing them with legal support. And then a question to the panel as a whole, if I can speculate, if China does choose to go down this road, what would be some of the implications? How would that set us for the course?
First of all, it's hard for me to talk about certain things. But your statement that Russia is supplying all sorts of high-tech support is a proposition. And it was something that would have to be analyzed, and you'd have to have a lot of intelligence on it. Now, we know that China has sold semiconductors to Russia. The question is what kinds, and are they in violation of the threatened secondary sanctions? And that's an open question, and it's not one I would be able to answer if I knew the answer to it here. So I just have to lay that out as an opening statement. I also can't talk about anything that I've seen regarding weapon sales. But I can say that there's tremendous concern about both in Washington. The initial red line that was given to China at the outset of the war was about lethal aid. And then it morphed into this much more robust sanctions regime against Russia and the secondary sanctions accompanying it. I mean, I think you would understand why selling a semiconductor that can then potentially be put inside a weapon and then used in the Ukraine theater is a little different than transferring killer drones or artillery or aircraft or bombs or, whatever, right? It's much more direct to be involved in a war with the weapons. But I think the first thing would be of great concern. And Secretary Raimondo had said that she would cripple the Chinese semiconductor industry writ large, not the current restrictions on the very high-tech chips, but very broad damage to the Chinese semiconductor industries if they were to do what you say the Wall Street Journal says they were doing. So we'll see about that too. But that would be of a piece. That would be of a piece. That would be China saying we can't afford this guy to fail in Ukraine because it's dangerous for our own national security defined in the Chinese special way. 国家安全 什么意思? Is it the nation? Is it the party? Is it the state? I think it's in many ways the state. And can we really afford this to happen? Now, the chips would be a major concern. Weapons would be a even greater concern. And I think it would be reacted to very strongly. We know that the German chancellor has said that it would be intolerable for China to do this. And apparently he talked to some Americans about what they had seen. I think it's all of a piece, and I think it would change things fundamentally if China was undercutting the pressure that's being put on Russia via Ukraine through NATO assistance and US assistance by backfilling Russian needs in the conflict. Ukraine would become the occasion for a Cold War battle between two camps. And I think that that's something that Beijing has to date very intelligently avoided. And I think the problem that they face is it appears that Putin is losing the war and they don't want to see him lose. And now they have this dilemma. It's a dilemma. So I think another thing I give the Biden administration strong marks on is I think what they did this weekend was really smart. Assuming, and I do assume, assuming that they have something really to be worried about in terms of China's weapons transfers to Russia, I think it was smart of them to get out in the public at a high level with great frequency and state their concerns about it, rather than wait till it happens and punish China later. Because my assumption, and here again, I'm giving them credit, my assumption is they don't want things to go down that path, not simply because they don't want Russia to have the weapons, but they don't want US-China relations to go down the hole that it will go down if that happens. So they're trying to stop it before it does. I hope they succeed, but what worries me is this problem, this dilemma is going to face China for many, many months to come, because this war is not ending anytime soon, and Russia's unlikely to get better in the war without Chinese help. So the temptation to assist Russia is going to be there over and over and over again. It's going to take tremendous restraint on China's part not to assist Xi Jinping's best friend in Moscow. And it worries me. That's why I think this week is a big moment in great power history, because the problem that may or may not have been solved this weekend by the Biden administration's public outreach is not going away. It's going to be there. And China has a very difficult choice to make. I don't think it's difficult because I'm not a communist. Right? I think it's simple. For China's national interest, they should condemn the Russian invasion. I think it's consistent with their arguments about Taiwan. I can't tell you how hard it is in Washington now to say the problem with cross-strait relations is you need to understand that for Beijing, this is a sovereignty issue. People's eyes roll really hard. Beijing and sovereignty? They won't even condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They don't believe in sovereignty. They're full of crap.
Tom, can I maybe give Christina a chance to speak about from Taiwan's perspective, because we spend enough time about like the one catastrophe enough. I think even more important is to how to avoid catastrophe over the Taiwan Strait, and from Christina's perspective, say a few words. Then if we have time, we can get. Let me on the panel. No, it's good chance to hear your insightful analysis. Yeah, Christina, have a few words.
Yes, so may I just elaborate more on my thought why the U.S. should shift from strategic ambiguity to
maybe
clarity.
Closer to the
clarity. I think there are certainly advocate supporter for strategic ambiguity for U.S.-Taiwan relation. But I think this concept right now has failed to recognize that this policy might work for the U.S., Taiwan, China triangle, but the concept itself, strategic ambiguity, may not really work well with the U.S.-led security network in the Asia Pacific. So I'm saying that we should really think about Taiwan's issue, or strategic ambiguity or clarity in terms of shifting from the perspective of U.S. ally management, right? So Taiwan's strategic location is really crucial to Japan, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, even Philippines, right? So Taiwan's future is created to eliminate tests where these countries will consider the United States credible enough, to possibly deter China's, territorial ambition or assertiveness. So I think in this sense, the United States really need to be resolute, purposeful enough to make the AUKUS, the Quad, and other security dialogue work and functionable in face of China's growing military modernization. Right? So I think together with successful diplomacy, engaging, deterring China at the same time, I think will be a time for us, for policymaker, scholars to really think about, how will you operational, how will you implement the strategic clarity, and I'm saying that this really from a different perspective. For example, I think U.S. ally and partner really consider China to be the growing threat, and Taiwan is also a flashpoint in East Asia. But so in that sense, they are still reluctant to be openly hostile to China, and because they think that some of the Asian countries, they still have a highly economic dependence on China. So from the perspective of alliance management, right, the U.S. need a more credible, coherent, and stabilizing security policy toward China and for U.S.-Taiwan-China triangle. And so that's why I think declaring strategic clarity could still have to be conducted with constant engagement with China, so that they can kind of fit into the kind of two elements, right? You deter China, but you also providing reassurance by providing dialogue, a channel of official visit, how to build up conflict resolution, stuff like that. So, and finally, I would say that the U.S.-led security network certainly has undergone changes, different going trend on in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think right now it's time to really kind of transforming the peacetime partnership into the substantive security operation during this critical contingency, such as Taiwan, U.S. possible involvement in Taiwan's conflicts or the Senkaku Island or a possible territorial dispute in the South China Sea. So I think in that sense, I think much of our debate on how much ambiguity the United States should maintain toward Taiwan is somehow misplaced, as it reflects a really narrow focus on U.S., Taiwan, China triangle. Right? I think it would be a great time to really think about, taking into account U.S. alliance management strategy in the Asia Pacific. Right. So finally, I would just say that maybe in a hypothetical scenario, right, the Quad, AUKUS, and other U.S. partner would have to devote more resource and effort in balancing against China if Taiwan were to fall under Beijing's control. So I think some of these countries might be more likely to hedge between China and United States, and the certainty will also increase the risk of U.S. entrapment and leading to more conflict in the Asia Pacific. And that is, in that sense, I think strategic clarity for Taiwan and embedded Taiwan into the security network, such as liberal international order has supported. So I think that's kind of my view, how Taiwan should really fit into the liberal international order and the multilateral security network in Asia. And finally, I would just say that maybe look into the future. I think Asia probably will become a mixed picture for conflict and cooperation, right? And the Biden administration would likely to enhance cooperation in countries in East Asia, such as Vietnam, Canada, and South Korea, and they're planning for coordination, military response to the possible conflict over Taiwan. And I think political leader or a policy analysis or scholar should really prepare for initiatives such as strengthening situational awareness over kind of China-Taiwan conflict contingency, and deepening policy coordination, right? Increasing intelligence sharing, and as when we look into how United States reconfigure its military posture in the Indo-Pacific, I think declaring strategic clarity to Taiwan and how manage how to maintaining its leadership in the Indo-Pacific will be the most important thing right now.
Okay, we almost have no time, but maybe can quickly collect some questions. Maybe speaker quickly, maybe. You do still have one? Yeah. Just maybe, yeah. Very quick question. Anybody?
Over here as well.
Okay, yeah. Anybody?
Questions about India? India is part of the aspect. That's part of the Quad, but it's also part of the BRIC.
Yeah.
So, and I was wondering if India are joining the West now, is scalable with President China, so there's a growing anti-Western sentiment in India. So it's rather than what we call
Okay, maybe another one question, then we wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, my question was about East Russia specifically, but for President Zelensky, the Chinese perspective on the territories lost. Similarly, we lost Hong Kong. Okay, we lost Far East to Russia. So my question was, how, given the difficulties what China will have operating or uniting with Taiwan, why wouldn't China divert the attention to Russia, which is weakening, military is overextended, and its nuclear umbrella is, well, it's a real danger, but why wouldn't China prioritize acquiring East Russia?
Okay. In other, maybe, okay, wrap up. Anybody want to either?
Last questions, right?
Okay, yeah, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
This is one decision point. Situation. I'm curious, what are the things that you watching or think would be most relevant to Beijing's judgment about whether and how much to really step into this war effort? You described, first of all, their assessment of losing value, and also their expectation that the U.S. and NATO and intelligence continue to cause Russia to perform poorly in it. I guess I'm curious, tacking back to some of your earlier logic about closing windows of opportunity. Should Beijing reach the judgment that they may as well go for it now because they know that the U.S. and its allies are going to continue to provide legal support to Ukraine to cause Russia to continue to bleed out there, and they may as well, particularly if what you're saying is the real downside consequence for them is that secondary sanctions hit hard. You really actually decouple in a security and an economic sense over time, clean off by doing that. If they think that's happening anyway, what are the ways that you look at this indicators why they would or wouldn't go?
Who you want to go first? I don't want to just.
Yeah, okay, very quickly selected. You don't have to answer each question.
No Russian question.
Yeah, that's the first question. So I think the Russian.
I think I'd just like to answer the gentleman's question from the front row about, the question on India. Unfortunately, Dr. Miller had a family emergency and could not join us, so I'm a very poor substitute. But I would like to point out that, exactly the questions you raise about, economic groupings, question marks about the BRICS, about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Those are very separate. And I would argue that, the Indian elite debate is keeping those very separate from that of questions to do with security. So security instruments and institutions like the Quad, like US attempts to try and frame India as a global security provider, a net provider of security to steam side by side, Navy by Navy. India has been very ambivalent, to put it politely, about any attempt to be seen as being a counterweight to China in ways that are not in India's own discrete national interests. And I think, again, to point out that, at least from my outside observation, that these Indian diplomats are operating with their own set of protocols and interests that they're seeking to pursue. On the Ukraine question, at least in the UN space, yes, they've taken heat for, again, repeated votes at the Security Council, at the UN General Assembly, where they will not condemn Russia. They are also very fair on going down that abstention vote line. And they leave a very short explanation of vote where they talk about their issues with the international order. And they are very clear that they will not be condemning Russia. Again, I believe if Raja Mohan was with us, he would say, Courtney, it's not to do with status and identity in a Security Council seat. It's the practical concerns about needing Russian arms. There's no indigenous capacity, but there is movement and debate about whether or not India will be able to develop such things and therefore give them a little bit more room to maneuver. But I think, again, to be mindful about economic partnership, economic incentive is very different than being grouped into organizations that are now being viewed by Beijing as being, to put it politely, explicitly anti-China. And I think India is a far more adept international player than sometimes given credit. But I'll stop there.
Second. Anybody else that want to quick?
For India, the Quad is an interesting concept, but you have the United States, you have Australia and Japan, who are real allies, and you have India. And India is really the outlier in the Quad. It's not a bad idea to talk about a full approach to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Well, that's fine, but it's not really a symmetrical set of relationships. India is really the outlier. In terms of Isaac's question, again, I think what Beijing should be doing is pressuring Moscow to pull out, and saying, you're hurting yourself, you're hurting our own geostrategic position, you're alienating the advanced world on whom we all depend. Russia used to depend on them, but they've severed their relationships with those countries. They could maybe restore them, I guess, over time. But China is very dependent on its relations with all these advanced economies that have been alienated by Russia. And I think the other piece of it is Beijing understanding that just how negatively those countries would react to China going a different route, which is to assist Putin in doubling down on his war of aggression in Ukraine and providing the weapons for him to do it over time, which China is quite capable of doing, is my impression, and blockifying the world into a kind of China, Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Iran camp, and a huge US-led camp, and then a bunch of countries in the developing world, and then who try to stay neutral, like we had during the Cold War. It would take a lot of work to get there in terms of economic pain because of this incredibly tight transnational production network. But the last thing you said, I don't agree with. I don't think China complains about decoupling, and China complains about containment. But the Chinese know that U.S.-China trade last year was at the second highest year in history, right? They know there hasn't been decoupling yet. And they know that decoupling would be really bad for everyone, including China. So it's not as if there isn't something to lose. There's a lot to lose. The transnational production chain is up and running. The restrictions on chips so far have been on very high level chips, not on everything, right? I do think that there are people in China who worry that that small yard with high fence is going to grow and grow and grow. And unfortunately, as an American who believes in free trade, I'm worried about it too, but not for geostrategic reasons. I'm worried that every protectionist in America, and there are lots of them, is going to glom on to the national security arguments to push for protectionism. So, that's my concern. But that's a little bit different than geostrategy. I think China's making a very, very bad set of choices. And the biggest bad choice that China made was linking itself to Putin's Russia. Because Putin's Russia is a revisionist actor trying to overturn the international system. I don't believe the PRC is, despite all the accusations in the United States that it is. But I think Russia is pulling China into acting in a way that is consistent with the U.S. accusation that will lead to a terrible U.S.-China relationship and lead to a terrible global international system. Well, it's pretty depressing. I'm depressing this.
Just one quick comment. I really liked your question about why doesn't Jesus decide, no, forget Taiwan. We have a much more fertile ground in the Russian Far East. There's some real problems with that argument, though. And simply put, first of all, I had a student from Heilongjiang, the border area, and I asked her, why haven't more people moved? And she said, are you kidding? Nobody wants to live up there. They all want to go to Shanghai. Okay. She can't speak for everybody, all 36 million, but I hadn't really thought about that a whole lot. But secondly, and perhaps geostrategically far more significant, if they were to actually do something that would undermine the whole thing that Tom just talked about. China wants Russia on its side in this global geostrategic alignment to counter the US, the unipolar power. So, I mean, you would totally destroy the alignment. And then third, the reason I got intrigued a while ago when I started looking into the border issue was there are Chinese scholars who do talk about exactly what you said. Hey, we lost all this land, it was stolen from us, we should have it back. And that really got my attention. I thought, wow, but it's not official, it's just a scholarly journal, probably some low-level scholar, but people are actually talking about that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So we're a little bit, few minutes behind the schedule. My apology for mismanagement of the, but
It's because you invited me.
okay. Oh, but it's good
My
signal.
fault.
I mean, because
My fault.
the afternoon session, we cannot stop. I think it means the conversation is like high quality, right? So let's get all the panelists applaud.
But do you think there's really a chance that people can live a natural life? I mean, honestly, and it's like live into a new village.